We all know that being a companion of the Prophet was an honor, but what we rarely imagine is how grueling it could be. Endless marches under scorching sun, dust in every breath, thirst that gnawed at the throat, and the weight of impossible decisions. The road to Siffin was no gentle journey. In today's video, we'll talk about why it truly sucked to be a companion in the Battle of Siffin, and more. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. The stillness of dawn never lasted long on the open road. As the early light stretched across the camp, figures slowly rose from their blankets, brushing the dust from their clothes and readying themselves for another day of travel. The path to Siffin was not a single road, but a winding thread through shifting sands, uneven terrain, and stretches of land that seemed to repeat endlessly. Each morning began like this: quiet, heavy, and filled with the unspoken understanding that the day ahead would ask much from every heart and every step. Travel in the 7th century was never gentle, even in peaceful times. But on this journey, with tension hanging in the air like a distant storm, the fatigue seemed to settle more quickly on everyone's shoulders. The caravan moved slowly, its pace determined by the weakest animals, the heaviest loads, and the men who bore responsibilities heavier still. Some companions walked beside their camels, choosing not to ride so that others could rest. Others scanned the distant hills, alert for any sign of movement, friend or foe. Dust rose with every step, clinging to robes, settling into beards, slipping beneath eyelids despite every attempt to shield them. It filled the throat with a dryness that water could only briefly soothe. And water itself was a carefully guarded blessing, rationed, shared, and treasured. Each sip carried a reminder that the road ahead was long and the resources few. Even the strongest voices softened when asking for it, as though speaking too loudly might frighten the precious supply away. Still, despite the hardship, the companions traveled with purpose. They were bound not only by loyalty to their leaders, but by a shared belief that they were doing their best to preserve unity in a moment when unity strained under the weight of disagreement. No one wanted discord. No one wished for conflict. Yet the world did not always move according to human hopes, and the road to Siffin was walked with hearts divided between duty and concern. Along the journey, conversation ebbed and flowed like desert wind. There were stretches of silence, long, contemplative moments when the only sound was the creak of leather straps and the rhythmic thud of hooves. Then there were pockets of quiet companionship, where men spoke of their families, their homes, and the days when travel meant trade or pilgrimage rather than the possibility of standing on the edge of battle. These gentle exchanges offered warmth, small reminders of the life that waited beyond the conflict. But beneath these moments lay tension, not hostility, but the unease of entering something none of them truly wanted. The companions wrestled with questions they didn't voice aloud. Would there be understanding? Would there be peace? Would the disagreement end before the swords were drawn? They hoped so. They prayed for it. Yet with each passing mile, the landscape itself seemed to grow heavier, as though the earth understood, before they did, what the days ahead might contain. The road was long enough that the days blurred into one another. Sunrise, march, brief rest, march again, gather under the dimming sky, whisper prayers into the cooling air. then sleep beneath scattered stars. Every cycle carried its own strain. The heat of midday could exhaust even the strongest among them, while the cold nights seeped into bones that had spent hours under the sun. Animals groaned under weight. Men winced at sore muscles, and the desert itself seemed to test them at every turn. Yet despite all this, the companions pressed on, not because the journey was easy, but because sometimes hardship was a path one could not turn back from. The road to Siffin was not a choice by this point. It was a responsibility, one tied to conscience, loyalty, and the hope that clarity might rise from confusion when they finally reached the banks of the Euphrates. As the caravan crested a small ridge one afternoon, the distant shimmer of the river appeared at last, a thin ribbon of blue against the vast sand. The sight should have brought relief, but instead, it settled like a quiet reminder. Arriving at Siffin was not the end of their struggle. It was merely the doorway into the next chapter of it, where the environment itself would challenge their endurance in ways the road never had. And now, with Siffin just ahead, the companions stepped forward into the heat, unaware of how the land itself would soon test them far more deeply than the journey behind them ever had. The first full day near Siffin revealed a truth the long road had hinted at but never fully declared. The land itself would be as unforgiving as any opponent. The companions soon realized that whatever hesitation or hope they carried into this place would be shaped, and sometimes overshadowed, by the environment around them. The Euphrates shimmered in the distance, promising relief, but the surrounding plains held a different temperament altogether, one that tested even the most patient hearts. As the sun climbed, the ground seemed to rise with it, radiating heat upward in shimmering waves. The air thickened until breathing felt like effort, each inhale warm enough to dry the mouth before a single word could form. Even seasoned travelers, familiar with the desert's temper, found themselves adjusting their turbans, tightening their cloaks despite the heat, and seeking whatever sliver of shade a tent pole or camel could offer. The sun ruled over every thought, every movement, every pause. Sand, too, became a constant companion, one far less agreeable than any human ally. It crept into sandals, gathered in robes, and clung to skin slick with sweat. It worked its way into food, grinding faintly between teeth, and found its way inside water skins, even when tightly sealed. By midday, it coated eyebrows and beards in fine grains, turning faces into pale masks shaped more by the earth than by the men themselves. Some companions joked softly about carrying half the desert home in their clothes, but even humor felt dry and short-lived in such heat. When the wind rose, it carried the desert with it, filling the air with a whispering hiss that could sting exposed skin. It blurred distant shapes and forced the companions to narrow their eyes. Their vision caught between dryness and dust. Locating landmarks became difficult. Even the Euphrates, visible earlier, now seemed to waver and disappear behind layers of shimmering distortion. The land, in its own way, guarded its treasures and its torments equally. Yet the true trial came at night, when the sun finally surrendered, and the warmth vanished as though it had never existed. Where the afternoon baked the earth to unbearable heat, the evening chilled it instantly. Cloaks that had felt too heavy at noon became precious by dusk. Men huddled close to their small fires, trading places to shield themselves from the wind that snaked through the camp with surprising sharpness. The cold settled into bones, tired from marching, refusing to be dismissed easily. This cycle, blistering days and frigid nights, wore on everyone. It created a rhythm that made rest difficult, patience fragile, and strength something one had to summon again and again. Even the most steadfast companions found themselves pausing more often, rubbing sore eyes, stretching aching limbs, and adjusting their gear in repetitive motions that reflected not discomfort alone, but the constant negotiation between body and environment. Despite these hardships, there was a quiet resilience among them. Though drained by the sun's weight and the night's chill, they moved with the dignity of those who believed their struggle had purpose. Some recited verses softly to steady their hearts, while others walked in reflective silence, letting the vastness of the landscape remind them of their reliance on God. In these moments, faith wasn't merely a comfort, it was a necessity, as essential as water and shade. But as water became the quiet thought behind every gesture, a new anxiety began to take shape. The companions knew that the Euphrates, so close and yet so far, was not simply a river, it was a strategic lifeline. Access to it would determine far more than comfort. It would determine survival. And rumors soon reached the camp that the opposing forces had moved to control portions of the riverbank, creating an invisible tension felt even by those who had not yet approached the water. As the sun set once more, and the cold again claimed the plains around Siffin, the companions wrapped themselves tightly in their cloaks, aware that the next challenge loomed just beyond the horizon. If the desert had tested their endurance, the struggle for water would test something deeper: their resolve, their unity, and their ability to face scarcity with patience. And so, with the stars faintly flickering above the restless camp, the companions unknowingly stepped toward the next weight on their journey: the contest for control of the Euphrates. The struggle against the desert's heat had already pressed heavily on the companions, but the true weight of Siffin revealed itself when the question of water became more than a discomfort. It became a looming concern that shaped every conversation, every motion, and every quiet breath. As the camp settled near the Euphrates, the promise of relief lay shimmering before them, yet just out of reach, guarded by forces with the same desperation and determination. The river was no longer simply a river. It was the line between endurance and collapse. Rumors spread quickly, passed from tent to tent in hushed tones that carried more fear than anger. The opposing forces had taken control of key approaches to the riverbank, limiting access and forcing the companions to consider what had once seemed unthinkable: that even with the Euphrates a short walk away, thirst could become their most immediate enemy. The knowledge settled over the camp like a second layer of heat, one that clung not to the skin, but to the heart. Men found themselves glancing toward the distant water more often now, squinting through dust to catch even the faintest glimmer of the river's surface. Water skins, once casually slung across shoulders, were now checked repeatedly, lifted to gauge their weight, shaken gently to listen for the reassuring sound of liquid within. A few drops spilled by accident felt like a small tragedy, a mistake to be silently mourned. Access to the river could not be reclaimed by frustration alone, and so the companions began rationing with renewed discipline. Water, which had always been precious in the desert, now held a deeper gravity. Each sip was measured and deliberate, each moment of relief tinged with the awareness that the next might not come so easily. The leaders among them encouraged patience, reminding the men that haste and fear could drain spirits faster than thirst itself. Still, rationing brought its own trials. Lips cracked, throats tightened, and tempers, despite best efforts, sometimes frayed at the edges. A companion who had slept restlessly might wake with a sharper tone. Another, after a day in the sun, might fall silent rather than risk speaking harshly in hunger or thirst. Yet even in these strained moments, there was a quiet nobility, a shared understanding that everyone suffered together, and therefore each man bore a responsibility to carry hardship with grace. Small patrols were sent to search for alternative sources, shallow wells, hidden springs, even damp patches of earth where water might gather beneath the surface. Most of these searches yielded little more than hope, and hope alone could not fill a water skin. Still, the effort mattered. Movement, planning, and the presence of purpose warded off the suffocating weight of helplessness. Even the animals felt the strain. Camels groaned when water was withheld a little longer, and horses stamped wearily as their caretakers brushed dust from their coats with limited moisture. Caring for the animals became an act of quiet devotion, a reminder that the companions were not the only ones depending on dwindling reserves. As the uncertainty deepened, decisions became more deliberate. No unnecessary trips under the sun, no wasteful washing, no casual pouring of water to cool a burning hand or face. Life narrowed to essentials, and essentials were measured by the smallest of drops. The river remained close, close enough to tease, close enough to haunt, and each evening's prayer carried the same gentle plea, that access might open without bloodshed. Discussions among the commanders grew more urgent, though outwardly calm. Strategies formed, negotiations attempted, messages sent. But even as they sought a peaceful resolution, every man in the camp understood that the desert was a silent witness to their struggle, and it cared little for fairness. The land simply waited, indifferent to who controlled the river or how many sleepless nights the companions endured. In these moments, the hardship of water shortage made every other challenge feel heavier. Thirst had a way of sharpening awareness, not only of the environment, but of hunger as well. Dry mouths soon reminded men of dry stomachs, and rationing water inevitably led to rationing food. Supplies that once seemed adequate now appeared meager under the combined pressure of heat and deprivation, as the companions prepared for another long day of measured sips and anxious glances toward the river. One truth settled clearly among them. If water determined their strength, food would soon determine their endurance. And so, the worries of thirst slowly merged with the worries of hunger, leading them into yet another layer of hardship, waiting beyond the desert's horizon. Thirst had a way of sharpening the senses, but hunger carried its own quiet persistence. After days of watching the river from a distance, the companions found that their thoughts, once centered on water alone, now drifted inevitably toward food. How much remained, how far it would stretch, and how many days they could endure the gnawing emptiness that crept into their stomachs. As water became scarce, so too did the ease with which they consumed the simple provisions they had brought from home. Meals on campaign were never luxurious, but here, near Siffin, even the familiar staples felt sparse. Dry dates, once sweet and energizing, now seemed to shrink with every passing day. Their texture grew tougher, their sweetness muted by the dryness of the mouth that tried to chew them. Dates that might once have been eaten by the handful were now taken one at a time. Pit removed carefully. The fruit savored slowly, as though delaying its disappearance could fill the stomach more completely. The coarse bread, baked days earlier, had hardened into something closer to stone than food. Men softened it by holding it near the steam of boiling water, when they had enough water to spare, or by dipping it briefly into whatever liquid they could manage to save. Even then, chewing required patience. Every bite reminded them that food, like water, was limited, and every crumb felt like something precious. Portions dwindled. What had once been half a loaf became a quarter, then a sliver. Dates that were once shared generously were now divided with careful precision. A small handful of barley might be cooked into a thin porridge, stretched with enough water to feed several men, though it filled no one. And yet, even as the meals grew sparse, the companions maintained a quiet discipline, rarely complaining, rarely raising their voices in frustration. Hardship shared was hardship softened, even if the stomach remained empty. Still, hunger carried an emotional weight heavier than anyone expected. Long marches and shifting sands could be endured. The scorching sun could be met with determination. Cold nights could be managed with layered cloaks and prayer. But the dull ache of hunger, repeating itself hour after hour, had a way of sapping strength from the body and resolve from the mind. A man could walk long distances, but he could not outrun the emptiness inside him. Some companions distracted themselves with conversation, telling stories of meals from home, the warmth of fresh bread, the richness of dates soaked in milk, the aroma of dishes cooked by loved ones. Others avoided such conversations altogether, finding them too painful, the memories too sharp against the reality of their rationed meals. A few traded small pieces of food, not out of greed, but out of a desire to help someone whose day seemed especially difficult. Even the animals felt the strain. Camels were given reduced measures of fodder, and horses were fed sparingly to conserve supplies. Their tired movements mirrored the tired steps of their caretakers, creating a quiet bond between man and beast, each relying on the other to endure. As the days passed, it became clear that hunger was no longer just a physical discomfort. It was a logistical concern threatening the stability of the entire camp. Supplies brought from Medina and Kufa could not last indefinitely, and procuring food in the barren plains around Siffin was nearly impossible. Trade caravans avoided the region due to the tension surrounding the conflict, and the local terrain offered little that could be foraged. Leaders and commanders gathered repeatedly, their discussions growing more serious with each meeting. Decisions had to be made: when to redistribute supplies, how to conserve enough food to maintain strength, whether to attempt negotiations again regarding access to the river, and how to manage a growing army with shrinking resources. Every choice carried risk, every delay carried cost. And so, hunger became more than a companion. It became a shadow looming over every movement, every prayer, every quiet moment before sleep. The companions bore it with patience, but patience alone could not refill their stores. The strain began to show in the weary steps, the long silences, the distant gazes fixed on what little food remained. Yet even as their stomachs ached, they understood a deeper truth. This was only one part of the hardship they faced. The challenge extended beyond meals and rations. It reached into the heart of their entire journey, touching every burden they carried and every decision yet to come. For if hunger reflected the immediate struggle, the larger, more complex logistical strain surrounding camp life was waiting just ahead, ready to reveal the next layer of difficulty the companions would have to endure. Hunger lingered through the day, but the nights brought their own tests, subtle, persistent, and exhausting in ways no ration plan could solve. After the evening prayer, when the camp attempted to settle, the companions felt the weight of their surroundings more sharply than during the day. The dimness made familiar shapes shift. The wind carried different tones, and the shadows of tents stretched long and uncertain across the hardened ground. Sleep, instead of providing rest, became another challenge to navigate amid the growing burdens of Siffin. The tents themselves, simple and lightly constructed, offered only the illusion of shelter. Made of coarse fabric stretched over wooden supports, they flapped loudly whenever the night wind picked up. Sand slipped in from every angle, gathering in small dunes against the edges of sleeping mats, coating clothing and settling between layers of blankets. A man could shake out his cloak repeatedly, only to find a fine dusting of grains within minutes. Cleanliness became a luxury. Comfort became a memory. Inside the tents, space was limited. Companions slept shoulder to shoulder, their breaths mingling, their movements carefully measured to avoid disturbing the men beside them. Even small shifts, a turning body, a cough, a foot adjusting against the cold, could ripple through the group, waking someone who had barely begun to drift into sleep. Privacy was non-existent, and the quiet conversations before rest carried the soft tones of men trying to maintain dignity amid constant closeness. And then there was the vigilance. Every night, a rotation of guards paced the perimeter, their footsteps steady against the hard ground. Their silhouettes passed like silent shadows between tents, reminding everyone that danger, though unseen, was never fully absent. The companions trusted their guards, but trust did not erase tension. Many found themselves waking at the slightest sound, the clink of metal, the snort of a restless camel, the whisper of fabric in the wind, hearts quickening before realizing the camp remained safe. Sleep came in fragments, rarely in the deep restorative stretches the men desperately needed. A companion might drift off for an hour, then awaken suddenly, unsure whether the sound outside was harmless or important. Dreams, when they came, were often brief and scattered, interrupted by stiffness, cold, or the murmur of hushed voices discussing the next day's tasks. Morning found most men rising already tired, their eyes heavy, their minds dulled by a night spent more in waiting than in resting. These sleepless nights took an emotional toll. A man who had arrived at Siffin with strong resolve might now feel the edges of doubt creeping into his thoughts. Weariness made every challenge seem larger, every decision heavier. Hunger, thirst, and fatigue formed a quiet trio of burdens pressing down on the heart. Yet despite all this, the companions rarely spoke of despair. Instead, they encouraged one another in soft voices, quoting words that strengthened patience, reminding each other that hardship was not new to their lives, nor foreign to their faith. Still, it was impossible to ignore the way the camp's energy changed with each passing night. Some men became more reserved, conserving emotional strength for whatever lay ahead. Others busied themselves with small tasks, tightening ropes, organizing supplies, smoothing the ground beneath sleeping mats, as though creating order in their personal space might bring order to the uncertainty around them. Leadership had to be attentive, guiding men who concealed their exhaustion out of duty and pride. And it was here, amid the restless nights, that the structure of responsibilities became increasingly important. Not every companion carried the same burden. Some were tasked with guarding, others with scouting. Some tended to the animals, while others prepared what limited food remained. Leaders strategized by lamplight, scribes copied messages, and envoys carried letters between camps. Each man's duty shaped his nights differently. Some stayed awake long hours. Others woke repeatedly to rotate shifts, and all felt the strain in unique ways. As the companions gathered before sunrise each morning, stretching stiff limbs and brushing dust from their clothes, the effects of sleeplessness were written clearly on their faces. Yet within the fatigue, there was also a quiet resilience, an understanding that shared responsibility held them together, even as the weight of the journey bore down. And now, as the demands of survival grew more complex, the roles and duties within the camp would become even more important, guiding the companions through the next layer of hardship waiting beyond the restless nights. The long nights of broken sleep made each morning feel heavier, but the structure of the camp did not allow the companions to dwell in fatigue for long. As soon as dawn's first light brushed the plains, duty called, quietly at first, then with unmistakable clarity. Every man understood that survival in a place like Siffin required order, discipline, and a willingness to carry whatever burden was placed upon his shoulders. And so, despite restless nights and aching limbs, the companions rose to meet their tasks. Roles had been divided days earlier, but as rations shrank and tensions grew, the importance of each assignment deepened. Guards took their positions along the perimeter, their eyes scanning the shifting horizon for signs of movement. Standing watch under the desert sun, where the chill of night was no simple assignment. Vigilance required constant attention, especially when exhaustion tugged at the mind. Yet the guards bore their duty with quiet resolve, understanding that even a moment of carelessness could endanger the entire camp. Scouts faced a different challenge altogether. They moved beyond the safety of the tents, traveling over unpredictable terrain to gather information about the land, the opposing forces, and any possible routes that might lead to water or supplies. Their journeys were long and often lonely, punctuated by moments of sudden tension when a distant figure appeared on a ridge or a dust plume suggested movement. Though they returned with valuable news, they also returned carrying the silent weight of responsibility only they could fully feel. Those assigned to carry supplies, the food, weapons, medical materials, and tools, took on a burden that was both physical and emotional. The loads were heavy, often awkwardly shaped, and balanced carefully to prevent damage. A broken jar of water or spilled grain was no small loss. Men tightened ropes, cushioned clay containers, and walked deliberately to protect what little they had left. Every successful delivery of supplies felt like a small triumph. Every accidental loss felt like a setback that affected the entire camp. And then there were those who tended to the wounded. Even though major battles had not yet erupted, minor injuries were inevitable. Blisters that cracked under the strain of marching, cuts from sharp rocks, burns from cooking fires, and illnesses brought on by fatigue and heat. The healers worked with limited resources, using what herbs they could find, boiling water sparingly, and relying on experience more than tools. Their work was quiet but constant, a reminder that hardship didn't wait for battle to begin. Each role was vital, yet none were without pressure. The companions did not complain, but the toll was visible in their movements. The slower steps, the distant gazes, the way they exhaled with a heaviness that went deeper than mere tiredness. Still, they supported one another. A guard would share a sip of water with a scout returning from a long journey. A man carrying supplies would pause to help someone adjusting a saddle. Healer would murmur encouraging words to soothe the worry of an injured companion. But beneath these acts of cooperation ran an undercurrent of tension, subtle yet unmistakable. As days passed, small questions began to stir in the minds of the companions. How long would they remain in this stalemate? Would negotiations fail? Would conflict erupt? These questions carried no answers, and in the absence of clarity, whispers began to move through the camp, soft at first, then growing as uncertainty deepened. Rumors, as they often do, slipped between tents like shadows, impossible to grasp and yet difficult to ignore. Some spoke of reinforcements approaching from distant cities, others of strategic maneuvers happening beyond the hills. Still others speculated about negotiations that might resolve the conflict peacefully, or might worsen tensions entirely. None of these whispers were confirmed, yet each carried enough truth to spark unease. For the companions already burdened with responsibility, the rise of rumors added a new weight, one that pressed not on the body but on the heart. Even the bravest among them found themselves glancing more often toward the horizon, wondering what news the next scout might bring, or what message might arrive from the commanders. And so, amid the duties that shaped each day, a quiet anxiety began to take root, growing slowly yet steadily. The companions could carry supplies, guard the camp, tend the wounded, but they could not guard against uncertainty. That, perhaps, was the heaviest burden of all. Soon, the whispers would grow louder, weaving doubt and hope in equal measure as the camp braced for whatever news the next dawn would bring. Uncertainty crept through the camp with the same persistence as the desert wind. Quiet at first, barely noticeable, and then suddenly everywhere. The whispers that had begun in passing now wove themselves into nearly every conversation. Scouts brought back information, but with each report came gaps, ambiguities, and questions. The companions listened carefully, trying to piece together a clear picture from fragments. Yet the more they learned, the more they realized how little they truly knew. And that lack of clarity weighed heavily on minds already strained by hunger, sleeplessness, and the burden of duty. Rumors came from every direction. Some suggested that the opposing forces were preparing to negotiate once more. Others said that tensions were escalating, that the river would remain contested, and that conflict might be only days away. There were whispers about movements along the riverbank, about unexpected reinforcements, about letters exchanged between leaders. Each new piece of information, whether rooted in truth or speculation, carried enough weight to unsettle even the most steadfast hearts. Men tried to make sense of it all, gathering in small groups after prayer or leaning close to one another in the dim light of lanterns. No one spoke loudly. No one wished to stir panic or fuel confusion. Instead, conversations unfolded in hushed tones, marked by long pauses as companions considered the possibilities. A single statement could begin a ripple of worry that extended far beyond the speaker's intention. Even silence became meaningful, an unspoken acknowledgement that no one fully understood how events might unfold. For the companions, the uncertainty was not merely political or strategic. It was deeply personal. They were Muslims facing Muslims, believers facing believers, hearts strained by a conflict no one wished to see escalate. The knowledge that unity, the very foundation of their community, hung in the balance, created a heaviness that settled into every thought. The companions were not merely soldiers on a battlefield. They were men bound by faith, by history, by shared prayer mats and shared memories. The idea that disagreement could evolve into something far more painful tightened the chest and darkened the horizon. As anxiety grew, some companions withdrew into contemplation. They recited verses softly beneath their breath, seeking calm in the familiar rhythms of remembrance. Others paced the edges of the camp, as though movement might help unravel the knots of uncertainty within them. A few sought counsel from learned men or trusted leaders, hoping for guidance that could steady their inner turmoil. But even the wisest voices could offer only reassurance, not answers. The situation was more complex than anyone wished it to be. Nighttime, once simply a struggle against cold and discomfort, now carried a deeper weight. Men lay awake listening to the murmurs outside their tents, trying to distinguish between ordinary sounds, wind, footsteps, the shifting of fabric, and the subtle tone of conversations that hinted at new developments. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was light, easily broken by a sudden shout or even the soft clearing of a throat nearby. The mind, restless and wary, refused to let the body fully rest. Yet within this web of uncertainty, something else began to emerge. Something quieter, but stronger. As companions looked around at one another, they were reminded of why they had come. Loyalty. Not blind loyalty, but loyalty rooted in conviction, in love for their faith, in their desire to protect the unity of the Muslim community. It was this loyalty that made the uncertainty so painful, yet it was also what kept them steady. Despite fear and speculation, they remained by one another's side, committed to their roles, their leaders, and their purpose. Even in the midst of confusion, the camp did not fracture. Men still rose for prayer together. They still shared what food and water remained. They still performed their duties with dignity, even when worry clouded their hearts. Loyalty, in this fragile moment, became a lantern, its light small but unwavering, guiding them through the fog of uncertainty. But as loyalty grew clearer in their hearts, it also brought new questions. How does one stay true when conflicts arise among the believers? How does one navigate devotion when unity trembles? These were questions no rumor could answer. And so, the companions braced themselves for the next reality of their journey, the emotional weight of loyalty in a time when the path ahead was anything but certain. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the council hall, painting the stone floor in muted golds and silvers. For a moment, it seemed the world had paused, yet even in that fragile stillness, the weight of uncertainty pressed on the companions' shoulders. They had weathered battles, braved storms, and endured losses that could have shattered anyone less steadfast. But now, the challenge was subtler, almost invisible. The pull of division, the gnawing temptation to bend their principles for the promise of favor or security. At first, it came in whispers, a quiet suggestion to compromise, to look the other way, to weigh loyalty against expediency. At night, when the companions huddled around the dwindling fire, they debated quietly, careful not to let their fears spill over into accusation. Each felt the tug of obligation to their friends, to their people, and to the ideals that had carried them through darker days. Yet the political landscape was shifting like sand underfoot. Every decision scrutinized, every alliance questioned. Even the strongest of them felt the tremor of uncertainty in their hearts. "I never thought it would come to this," murmured Lysandra, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "To choose between what is right and what is safe. It feels like there is no middle ground anymore." Her words echoed the unspoken thought that had been growing among the companions for weeks. That righteousness was no longer an abstract virtue to be admired from afar, but a daily test, measured in choices both monumental and minute. Kael, who had always prided himself on clear judgment, found his certainty eroding. He scrutinized every proposal, every petition, every whispered rumor, wary of being swayed by charm or fear. And yet, even in doubt, there was a stubborn flicker of resolve. Loyalty, true loyalty, was not blind obedience. It was the courage to act rightly, even when the consequences were uncertain. Outside the council walls, the city itself mirrored the fracture within. Streets that once hummed with commerce and camaraderie now bore the tension of conflicting factions. Citizens whispered their fears to one another, wary of showing preference, fearful that a single misstep could invite retribution. In every corner, in every quiet alley, the companions could feel the pulse of division, a reminder that the trials of the battlefield had been nothing compared to the trials of conscience. Amid this turmoil, the companions began to understand that loyalty was not a simple pledge. It demanded discernment, humility, and above all, courage. They could not merely follow orders or cling to tradition. They had to weigh the morality of their actions, the long-term consequences of compromise, and the hearts of those who depended upon them. Each choice was a small battle, fought not with swords or shields, but with conviction and clarity. As the day waned, and the council prepared To receive emissaries from the opposing side, the companions sensed the inevitable confrontation looming. This was the moment when their loyalty would be tested against cunning and ambition, when ideals would clash not just with policy, but with human desire and fear. They knew that the coming dialogue would demand their utmost discernment. To act wrongly, even in subtle ways, could unravel the fragile trust they had worked so hard to maintain. Yet even in the shadow of division, there was resolve. The companions understood that their unity, tempered by principle, could serve as a beacon in the growing uncertainty. They would listen, they would question, and they would hold fast to the truth as they saw it. But they also recognized that understanding the opposing side, the motivations, fears, and desires that drove their adversaries, was as critical as defending their own convictions. Only by stepping into that mirror of challenge could they hope to navigate the treacherous currents ahead without losing themselves. The chamber doors opened, letting in a cold wind that carried the distant murmur of voices. In that instant, the companions drew a collective breath. The time for reflection had passed. The test of loyalty, of courage, of conscience was beginning. And in the hearts of each, the same quiet question lingered. Would they stand steadfast or be swept away by the tides of division? The companions stepped onto the ridge overlooking the valley, where the opposing army had gathered like a restless tide. From this distance, they could see not a faceless host, but individuals, soldiers with worn armor, banners dulled by wind and sun, and the subtle signs of exhaustion etched into every posture. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to pause, and the companions were struck by a quiet, unsettling realization. These were people, not mere obstacles to overcome. For months, rumors had painted the enemy in broad strokes of malice and ambition. Yet now, observing them in the cool morning light, the companions saw hardship mirrored in familiar ways. They recognized the same hunger for home, the same longing for safety, the same fatigue that weighed on every shoulder. Every line of weariness, every hesitant glance, told a story of struggle not unlike their own. This recognition stirred an unexpected compassion, complicating the simplicity of us versus them that had once guided their thinking. Lysandra tightened her cloak against the wind and let her gaze sweep across the enemy lines. "They are not so different," she murmured. "We speak of honor, of loyalty, yet here, across this divide, they seek the same." Kael, ever cautious, nodded, but allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had trained to anticipate strategy, to measure strength, to exploit weakness. Yet strategy alone could not account for the weight of understanding. To respect the other side, truly respect them, meant acknowledging that every soldier carried reasons for standing where they did, burdens that were not of their own choosing. It meant seeing motives and fears, not just formations and numbers. The companions began to piece together the humanity beneath the armor. They noticed the young conscripts whose hands trembled as they adjusted their grips on their weapons, the veterans whose eyes had grown wary from years of conflict, and the medics moving quickly from one soldier to the next, offering what little comfort they could. Even from a distance, the companions felt the threads of exhaustion, fear, and hope that connected these lives, threads that were strikingly similar to their own. As they descended into the plain, the wind carrying dust and distant voices, the companions' thoughts turned to the cost of confrontation. Each step toward the other army was a reminder that battle, while often inevitable, was not without consequence. They understood that every decision, every engagement, could escalate pain for both sides. The prospect of avoiding unnecessary conflict weighed heavily, demanding careful negotiation and patience, as well as a readiness to stand firm when compromise was impossible. Even as they approached, the opposing army did not behave with aggression. They mirrored the same caution and vigilance that the companions felt. There was a silent negotiation in posture, a dialogue of intent that needed no words. Each side tested the other, not with immediate attack, but with observation, gauging resolve and temperament. In that moment, the companions realized that understanding did not weaken them. It gave them power, not over the enemy, but over the choices that would shape the coming confrontation. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Every face, every movement spoke to the complexities of loyalty, survival, and principle. The companions sensed that the true test was not in striking first or in forcing retreat, but in navigating a landscape of shared humanity where every action carried weight far beyond strategy. They carried with them the lessons of their own internal struggle, that loyalty must be tempered with wisdom, courage balanced with restraint, and conviction tempered by empathy. As the two forces drew closer, the companions steeled themselves, aware that dialogue could be as decisive as any clash of steel. They would need to meet the other side, not as enemies to be destroyed, but as fellow bearers of hardship, driven by motives as real and compelling as their own. To fight blindly would be to betray the understanding they had fought so hard to preserve within themselves. In the stillness, before the first words were spoken, each companion felt the tension thrumming through the air, not the tension of hatred, but of possibility. They were poised on the edge of choice, to engage in needless conflict or to seek resolution with eyes wide open to the trials and truths of the other side. And in that pause, they understood something vital. Respect and awareness did not erase danger. It prepared them to face it with clarity, courage, and conscience. The companions stood on the fringe of the plain, their eyes tracing the careful formations of the opposing army. The morning air was crisp, yet heavy with anticipation, as if the valley itself was aware of the delicate balance between diplomacy and disaster. With every step closer, the weight of responsibility pressed upon them more insistently. They carried not only the hope of their own people, but the unspoken duty to spare lives wherever possible. Letters had already been dispatched, messages carefully worded to appeal to reason and honor, rather than to provoke fear. Delegates moved between encampments with the precision of choreographed steps, carrying petitions, proposals, and earnest requests for dialogue. Each missive was weighed for nuance, each word chosen to convey respect without surrender. The companions knew that rhetoric alone could not hold back the tide of war, yet they trusted in the power of communication to bridge what swords threatened to sever. Lysandra watched the couriers go, her mind restless. She had spent countless hours drafting appeals, revising phrases to ensure clarity and fairness. And yet she could not suppress the gnawing doubt. Would words reach those hardened by suspicion, or would they be dismissed as weakness? She turned to Kyle, who stood silently, observing the distant figures of their counterparts. "They listen," she said quietly. "At least, they seem to consider. That counts for something." Kyle's reply was measured. "Consideration is not compliance. We must be prepared for failure, even as we hope for success." His eyes lingered on a contingent of soldiers adjusting their banners in the wind. "Every action we take now, every gesture, matters. If we falter, if we misstep, blood will be on all our hands." In the first days, the attempts at arbitration seemed promising. Emissaries returned with cautious optimism, noting that their messages were received and discussed, that minor concessions were entertained, and that a shared desire to avoid unnecessary bloodshed existed, at least in part, on the other side. Meetings were arranged in neutral spaces, small groups convening to negotiate terms of truce, supplies, and territorial respect. In these moments, the companions glimpsed the fragile possibility of peace, a thread delicate but tangible enough to hold hope. Yet the strain of diplomacy was relentless. Letters went unanswered for days, then returned with ambiguous or contradictory responses. Miscommunications spiraled into tension. A gesture meant to signal goodwill was interpreted as condescension. A proposal offered in sincerity was perceived as threat. The companions found themselves repeatedly retracing their steps, revising messages, and debating whether any approach could truly reach the minds and hearts of those across the divide. Frustration began to grow, subtle at first, a tightening in the chest after a long day of unanswered questions. By the third week, that frustration had taken shape in sharp glances, terse replies, and heated discussions among the companions themselves. Even as they struggled to maintain composure, the pull of fear and impatience threatened to undo the careful progress they had made. Every day, without clear resolution, weighed heavier than the last, reminding them that time was not neutral. It favored momentum, and momentum often carried toward conflict. Lysandra clenched her hands at her sides as she read yet another ambiguous reply from the opposing counsel. "They delay," she muttered, voice tight. "Is it negotiation, or are they merely buying time to strengthen their position?" Cale's jaw tightened. "Perhaps both. And perhaps we are doing the same without realizing it. Diplomacy is never clean or simple. The important thing is that we keep trying. Bloodshed may loom, but it is not inevitable, unless we let frustration guide our hands." As night fell, and the distant fires of the opposing camp glimmered like stars scattered across the valley, the companions gathered together, weary but resolute. Each knew the road ahead would test their patience, their judgment, and their unity. Every letter sent, every meeting held, was a delicate step on a narrow bridge suspended above the potential chaos of war. And yet, even as frustration began to gnaw at their resolve, they understood that the effort to prevent bloodshed was worth every risk, every disappointment, and every sleepless night. The valley seemed to breathe around them, a silent witness to the fragile hope they carried. They would continue, despite the mounting challenges, because to act otherwise would betray the very principles they had fought to uphold. And in that commitment, however tested, they found a quiet strength, a resolve that would guide them into the uncertain days to come. The valley had grown quiet, but it was a silence thick with anticipation, the kind that pressed against the skin and settled deep in the chest. Days blurred into nights, each indistinguishable from the last, as the companions watched and waited, their bodies tense and minds restless. Letters had gone unanswered, emissaries returned with vague assurances, and every tentative gesture of goodwill seemed to dissolve before it could take hold. The waiting was not passive, it was a battlefield in itself, where anxiety, doubt, and exhaustion clashed invisibly with the companions' resolve. Lysandra paced the edge of their camp, her boots stirring the dust in small, restless clouds. Every sound, the distant clatter of armor, the shifting of tents, the occasional cry of a bird, seemed amplified, a reminder of the precarious calm. She had trained to act decisively, to meet threats head-on, but this limbo demanded a patience she was not accustomed to, and yet retreat or rash action would be disastrous. Every decision now required restraint, a balance between vigilance and stillness that was almost impossible to maintain. Kael sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they might offer some insight into the days ahead. He was no stranger to tension. He had faced storms at sea, ambushes in dark forests, and battles where every move could mean life or death. But waiting in this valley, when every moment carried the shadow of potential conflict, was a different kind of test. It eroded the mind slowly, wearing down certainty and amplifying fears. Every snap of a branch or gust of wind became a possible signal. Every shift in the enemy camp a portent. The companions' attempts at routine offered only partial relief. Training drills, patrols, and inspections filled hours, but could not stem the undercurrent of unease. Meals were eaten hastily, conversation was clipped, and sleep came in fits, punctuated by dreams of failure, blood, and regret. Even moments of humor, once a balm after battle, now felt hollow, echoes of a life they could no longer fully embrace. The psychological strain of inactivity weighed heavier than any sword, and each passing day intensified the tension coiled within their minds. Yet, they could not afford to surrender to frustration or despair. Supplies had to be managed, positions reinforced, and strategies reviewed. Every plan imagined the worst-case scenario: ambushes, sudden attacks, and the long, grueling toll of open battle. They studied the opposing army's movements obsessively, noting patterns, predicting rotations, and preparing contingencies. Even as they waited, they were constantly in motion, not with action, but with thought, calculation, and readiness. The waiting revealed fissures, too. Small disagreements over minor details flared into larger debates. Tempers were frayed, patience was short, and even the strongest among them found themselves questioning motives, past decisions, and the wisdom of their restraint. And yet, in these moments of tension, the companions discovered the value of shared burden, the ability to voice fear, to question strategy, and to reaffirm commitment without judgment. Their unity, tested by indecision and delay, became a quiet source of strength. Then, one gray dawn, the air changed. A distant drumbeat, subtle at first, drew the companions' attention. The enemy had moved, forming tighter ranks, sending scouts closer to their lines. The valley, long a place of tense stillness, now thrummed with imminent possibility. Hearts quickened, but there was no panic, only the sharp, focused awareness that all their preparation and restraint would soon meet reality. The companions took up their positions, weapons ready, eyes scanning every inch of the horizon. The waiting had honed their vigilance, trained their minds to anticipate, and tempered their nerves for what was to come. Yet, even as the first scouts crested the ridge, a profound exhaustion lingered. Waiting, they realized, was a battle of its own, a psychological drain as taxing as any skirmish, a crucible that tested patience, courage, and clarity of mind. And in that charged moment, the first arrows arced across the valley, and the stillness shattered. The companions braced, knowing that the long wait had ended, and the ordeal of battle, messy, uncertain, and inevitable, was about to begin. The first clash came quietly, almost unexpectedly, yet its impact was immediate. Scouts from both sides had edged closer than intended, drawn by curiosity or misjudgment, and a single misstep, a misread signal, a shouted warning, ignited the spark. Arrows arced across the valley, and the companions felt the sudden, jarring reality of what they had prepared for, but had long delayed. Conflict was no longer hypothetical. The sound was sharper than anticipated, the twang of bowstrings, the scrape of blades against shields, and the low, urgent shouts of men and women suddenly caught in motion. Lysandra's heart leapt into her throat, not from fear alone, but from the weight of responsibility. Every swing of a sword, every arrow loosed, carried consequences far beyond the moment. The injury, the loss, the ripple of grief it would send through families, communities, and the soldiers themselves. Kael moved with precision, rallying his companions, issuing commands that cut through the chaos. Yet even as strategy guided their actions, the emotional burden pressed on them. Faces blurred by adrenaline and dust, allies and opponents alike seemed interchangeable in the heat of the encounter, yet every life taken lingered in their minds. They had trained for combat, but training did not inoculate them against guilt, against the hollow ache of knowing that violence, however justified, leaves scars far beyond the battlefield. The skirmishes were brief but intense, testing not only skill, but judgment. Decisions made in fractions of a second, whether to pursue, to hold, to strike, or to retreat, were weighted with moral significance. A misjudged move could escalate the confrontation into full battle or leave innocents exposed. The companions felt the full tension between necessity and conscience, between survival and the desire to minimize suffering. From the ridge, the valley seemed smaller, the chaos concentrated in pockets that spread unpredictably. Soldiers ducked behind makeshift barriers, charged in sudden bursts, and collapsed, only to be replaced by others moving with urgent purpose. Smoke from torches mingled with the dust of trampled earth, and the distant cries of the wounded formed a haunting chorus that underscored the human cost of even a minor clash. Each skirmish revealed lessons, hard and immediate. Coordination mattered more than heroism, communication more than bravado, and foresight more than impulse. Lysandra noted how a single misstep, an unguarded flank, a momentary lapse in vigilance, could turn advantage into disaster. The companions recognized the delicate balance between courage and recklessness, between acting decisively and respecting the fragility of life. Yet amid the tactical maneuvers, the emotional toll deepened. Even small victories felt hollow. Every enemy who fell was someone's child, sibling, or friend. Every ally wounded or lost brought a fresh ache, a reminder that the price of conflict was always human. The companions shared fleeting glances, silent acknowledgement of their collective strain. Words were unnecessary. Each could see in the other's eyes the same exhaustion, the same gnawing tension between duty and conscience. As the day wore on, the skirmishes subsided into wary observation, both sides stepping back to tend to their wounded and reassess positions. The valley, once quiet with the strain of waiting, now bore the weight of reality. Even minor clashes left scars on the land, on the soldiers, and most insidiously on the hearts of those who fought. Lysandra lowered her sword, breath ragged, and surveyed the field. Broken branches, trampled grass, and scattered weapons told the story of a battle that was small in scale but enormous in consequence. Kael knelt beside a fallen soldier, offering comfort and ensuring the injured were tended. In these moments, strategy and morality intertwined, reminding the companions that every choice reverberated far beyond immediate survival. The first encounters had ended, but the lessons lingered. War, even in its earliest and smallest forms, was never clean or contained. Each clash carried consequences that multiplied in ways impossible to predict, and as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the valley in muted gold, the companions understood that the battlefield was not only a place of action, it was a mirror, reflecting the deepest complexities of courage, loyalty, and conscience. The valley, once a place of tense stillness, had transformed into a roiling landscape of confusion. Dust rose in thick, choking clouds, twisting in the wind and reducing visibility to mere feet in every direction. The sounds of combat, clashing steel, shouted orders, and the cries of the wounded overlapped into a disorienting cacophony. Even the most disciplined units struggled to maintain formation. Flags flapped wildly in the gusts, and signals meant to coordinate movements were swallowed by the relentless noise. Lysandra fought her way through the dust, her armor scratched and heavy, the taste of grit clinging to her tongue. Every movement required conscious effort, to strike, to parry, to stay upright on uneven ground while the tide of soldiers surged unpredictably around her. Orders she had drilled into muscle memory and training felt fragile here, fleeting. A single misstep could isolate a companion, expose a flank, or turn a brief advantage into disaster. In the chaos, clarity was rare, and decisions had to be made with intuition, sharpened by necessity. Kael shouted above the din, trying to rally their forces. He could see fragments of strategy unraveling as soldiers became entangled, misreading gestures or mishearing commands. In the distance, enemy banners flickered through the haze, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, never forming a coherent pattern. The battlefield was no longer a map to be followed. It was a living, breathing organism, unpredictable and indifferent to human planning. Everywhere, the companions felt the weight of uncertainty pressing in. Dust clogged lungs, obscured sight, and dulled hearing. The familiar rhythm of training was replaced by the instinctive ebb and flow of survival. as fighters improvised, adapted, and sometimes fell. Lysandra caught glimpses of allies and opponents alike, their faces blurred and smeared with sweat and grime, eyes wide with fear, determination, or pain. In that haze, the line between friend and foe became tenuous, and the moral clarity of who should live and who should fall was clouded as thoroughly as the valley floor. Amid this tumult, personal fear took root. It was not the dramatic terror of imminent death that had been tempered in earlier skirmishes, but a quiet, persistent awareness of vulnerability. Each companion recognized that despite skill and preparation, chance could undo them in an instant. A misjudged step, a hidden obstacle, a sudden surge from an enemy. The adrenaline that fueled action could not erase the stark, human awareness of mortality. Even Cale, usually steadfast and commanding, felt a tremor of apprehension when a soldier fell within arm's reach, the echo of impact reverberating through him. Communication broke down entirely in pockets of the battlefield. Messengers became lost in the churn, voices drowned by the relentless noise, and even gestures meant to signal retreat or advance were misunderstood. Plans dissolved into improvisation. Every companion had to navigate not only the enemy, but the unpredictable movement of allies, the random chaos of terrain, and the unseen consequences of each choice. One wrong turn could leave a gap in the line or trap a squad in a deadly bottleneck. In the midst of the storm of dust, metal, and shouting, the companions glimpsed the intimate realities of warfare. Not grand victories, but human vulnerability, small acts of courage, fleeting moments of clarity, and the constant, gnawing awareness of fragility. Each decision carried weight, each action had consequence, and each step forward required both courage and the humility to recognize one's limits. As the sun climbed higher, the dust began to settle in patches, revealing the scattered remnants of engagement, fallen weapons, trampled grass, and soldiers supporting the wounded. But even as the battlefield cleared, the companions felt the lingering tremor of fear and the heavy recognition that chaos could return at any moment. The battlefield was no longer an abstract concept or a distant test of strategy. It was immediate, personal, and relentless. Lysandra inhaled, tasting the acrid air, and met Cale's eyes. Both knew that beyond tactics and formations, beyond orders and plans, they faced the unshakable truth of war. Fear was as constant an opponent as any soldier, and mastering it was as essential as holding the line. The dust had barely begun to settle, yet the companions felt no relief. The valley seemed to hum with residual tension, a quiet that carried the weight of what had passed and the ominous possibility of what was yet to come. Fear lingered like a shadow, persistent and insistent, whispering doubts at the edges of thought. Each companion knew that courage alone would not suffice. Strength without trust risked tipping into recklessness. Lysandra knelt briefly beside a small grove, closing her eyes and offering a silent prayer. The words were simple, humble, requests for clarity, for courage, and for protection for those whose lives now teetered on the edge of fate. In that moment, faith became a tether, anchoring her heart amid the swirling storm of uncertainty. She drew a steadying breath, feeling the warmth of conviction seep into her chest, quieting the tremor that had accompanied every heartbeat since the first clash. Kael moved among the companions, offering guidance, encouragement, and reassurance. His voice carried authority, but there was gentleness beneath it, a recognition that fear was not weakness, but a natural companion to responsibility. "We act together," he said, voice firm yet calm. "We trust each other, and we trust the path we walk. That does not erase fear, but it gives it purpose." His words resonated, a subtle balm against the tension that gripped every heart. In these moments, the companions understood that faith was inseparable from action. It was not passive hope, but an active reliance on principles, on shared resolve, and on the unseen guidance that had carried them through countless trials. Each step, taken with awareness, each decision guided by both courage and conscience, became a small act of steadfastness, a refusal to surrender to panic even as danger pressed close. And yet, the valley demanded more than quiet reflection. The sensory chaos of battle returned with relentless intensity. The clash of steel, the whistle of arrows, the shouts of men and women pushing against exhaustion and fear. Dust and smoke coiled together, stinging eyes and choking lungs, blurring vision and muffling sound. Every sense was assaulted, yet within the storm, the companions discovered a strange clarity. Fear sharpened perception, while faith and trust anchored judgment. They moved with deliberate intent, eyes scanning for danger, ears attuned to calls for aid, hearts steady, even as the world erupted around them. Lysandra's sword struck again and again, each movement guided by training, instinct, and a quiet inner assurance. Around her, companions covered flanks, lifted the injured, and coordinated movements through gestures and shouts. Even when separated by chaos, each trusted the others to act with courage and care. In that trust, fear transformed from a paralyzing force into a driving presence, a reminder of what mattered and why the fight demanded clarity of heart as much as strength of arm. The valley itself seemed to respond to their steadiness. Where panic might have spread contagiously, discipline and faith held sway. Movements became purposeful, not frantic. Decisions, precise rather than hasty. Courage, intentional rather than impulsive. Even amid smoke, dust, and the erratic cries of battle, a thread of order emerged, a reflection of the companions' inner resolve, their unspoken bonds, and the strength drawn from trust in one another and in God. Every moment carried weight. Every action held consequence. And yet, amid fear and the sensory onslaught of conflict, the companions discovered that steadfast hearts could carve space for grace, courage, and clarity. Faith and trust did not erase the horrors of battle. They illuminated the path through it, guiding movement, focus, and conscience alike. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, the companions pressed forward, hearts steady despite the chaos. They knew fear would return, that the valley could erupt again at any moment. But in their shared faith and unwavering trust, they found the fortitude to act, to protect, and to endure. And in that fortitude, they glimpsed the possibility that even in the midst of chaos, the human heart could remain steadfast, guided by principle, faith, and the bonds of fellowship. The valley seemed alive with sound, yet fractured, uneven, as though every noise bore its own weight and meaning. Steel clanged against steel with a metallic fury, echoing off the rocky slopes and bouncing across the smoke-thick air. Shouts of command pierced the chaos, voices rising and falling with the rhythm of attack and retreat, each carrying authority, desperation, or encouragement. The companions moved through it all, senses sharpened, instincts humming in sync with every crack of armor and whistle of arrow. Amid the cacophony, moments of clarity emerged, brief and startling. Lysandra noticed a soldier's hesitation just long enough to warn a companion, preventing a fatal misstep. Kael's commands, steady and precise, cut through the noise, offering a fragile thread of order in the maelstrom. Every step, every parry, demanded complete attention. Distraction could mean injury or death. Yet the companions were attuned to more than strategy. They listened to the rhythms of fear, courage, and resolve that pulsed through the valley. Even the sounds of the wounded reached deeply into awareness. Groans, cries, and the dull thud of collapse punctuated the combat, reminding the companions that each movement had cost. Every clash carried consequence. Each life touched by the chaos became part of the valley's voice, a dissonant chorus of pain and endurance. And yet, there were also fleeting notes of hope, laughter muffled by dust, encouragement passed in a glance, a hand lifted to steady a comrade, small affirmations that life persisted even in violence. Then, as suddenly as it had erupted, the valley fell into silence. A pause unlike any the companions had known, heavy and surreal. The clamor of combat seemed to vanish, leaving only the muffled breathing of the living and the distant, eerie rustle of disturbed earth. In that quiet, every detail became exaggerated. The weight of armor, the rasp of a boot on dust, the soft hiss of wind threading through broken trees. The companions felt the emptiness pressing around them, a stark contrast to the intensity they had just survived. In this stillness, fatigue revealed itself with relentless clarity. Muscles quivered with exhaustion. Minds struggled to remain alert, and hearts pounded not just with fear, but with the relentless toll of sustained vigilance. Each companion recognized that the pause was temporary, that the silence could not erase the storm, but it forced awareness of limits, the vulnerability of the body, the strain of the psyche, and the finite nature of endurance. Lysandra sank briefly to her knees, inhaling raggedly, trying to steady the tremor that ran through her limbs. The battlefield sounds and sudden absence of them made her acutely conscious of the cost of war. She could feel the lives lost, the close calls, and the near misses, every thread of chaos etched into memory. Even as she rested, her mind ticked through the movements, anticipating what could erupt next, replaying flashes of combat with merciless precision. Kael moved among the companions, voice lowered, offering guidance and reassurance, even as his own exhaustion showed. He reminded them to breathe, to focus on the moment, to conserve strength for the inevitable continuation. Leadership, he knew, was not only in command, but in modeling endurance, in holding steady when the body and mind pleaded for respite. Each measured step, each careful word reinforced the fragile equilibrium of a unit stretched near its limits. The valley remained hushed, the silence thick with anticipation. Dust settled in patches, broken weapons lay scattered, and faint groans marked the wounded's attempts to recover. Yet even amid the quiet, tension lingered like a held breath. The companions felt it in their shoulders, in the tightening of their chests, in the vigilant sweep of eyes across the horizon. Rest was necessary, yet impossible in full measure. Vigilance could not be entirely relinquished. In this balance of sound and silence, of action and pause, the companions discovered the rhythms of war itself, a relentless ebb and flow, each surge followed by a breathless lull, each clash succeeded by a fragile calm. Fatigue pressed against them from all sides, yet within it there was clarity. The valley taught that endurance was as much about listening, observing, and pacing oneself as it was about skill with weapon or shield. And as the sun dipped low, painting the valley in dusky reds and golds, the companions knew that the sounds of war would return with renewed force. But they had learned the value of the silence in between, the necessity of resilience, and the strength that arose from steady hearts amid exhaustion. The valley's silence lingered like a weight, heavier now because it carried the residue of hours, days of relentless strain. Physical fatigue had been apparent for some time. Aching muscles, blistered hands, chafed skin, and bodies pushed to limits they had not thought possible. But as the companions moved through the aftermath of the skirmishes, they felt the deeper, more insidious drain, the exhaustion of spirit and mind. It was a fatigue not cured by rest, not soothed by a simple meal or a few hours of sleep. It seeped into thought, memory, and conscience, making every decision, every glance, every breath, an effort. Lysandra sank to a rock, leaning her forehead against her knees. Her sword, still streaked with dust and blood, rested at her side, almost a burden to lift. Her body wanted to collapse entirely, but it was her mind that protested more sharply. Each encounter replayed itself in fragments, the faces of the fallen, the cries of the injured, the fleeting moments where courage and fear collided. She had survived, but she carried the invisible weight of the lives she could not save, the compromises made in moments of survival, and the quiet, gnawing question of whether her actions had been enough. Kael moved methodically among the companions, checking in, offering encouragement, yet even his steady presence betrayed a quiet weariness. Leadership demanded that he appear unshakable, but inwardly, he too felt the erosion of spirit. Every decision to advance or hold back carried the gravity of potential loss, and the relentless pace of vigilance had left little room to process doubt, grief, or guilt. Even acts of courage were tempered with the shadow of their cost. The knowledge that heroism and heartbreak were inseparably entwined. The companions had begun to notice that exhaustion beyond the physical altered perception and patience. Small frustrations flared with disproportionate intensity. A miscommunicated instruction, a faltering hand during weapon maintenance, a minor injury treated slowly. Irritations that might have been brushed aside before now prickled the nerves, fraying tempers, and straining relationships. Emotional reserves, once ample, had been drained, leaving raw edges exposed and vulnerable. Faith, which had steadied them in earlier trials, now became both anchor and challenge. Moments of prayer or reflection provided comfort, but they also surfaced doubts, regrets, and questions of purpose. Lysandra's whispered invocations no longer always offered relief. Sometimes, they were reminders of responsibility too great for any mortal to bear alone. Yet even in that struggle, there was resilience. Faith did not erase fatigue, but it framed it, giving it meaning and a direction. Each act of endurance became a small testament to trust, principle, and devotion, even when the mind screamed for reprieve. Amid the emotional and spiritual exhaustion, practical duties demanded attention. The wounded, scattered across the valley, could not wait. Each injury, each groan required care, compassion, and methodical action. Lysandra and Kael moved from soldier to soldier, tending bandages, offering water, and lending words of reassurance. Physical care became intertwined with emotional support, as companions comforted those who trembled, shivered, or cried. The act of helping, though taxing, reminded them of purpose, offering a fragile balm to the deeper fatigue that threatened to overwhelm. Even small successes carried weight. A stabilized fracture, a bandaged wound, a whispered thanks. These fleeting victories illuminated the companions' resolve, giving them reason to continue despite exhaustion. The valley was strewn with hardship, yet in tending to others, the companions found fleeting restoration, a reminder that endurance was not measured solely by survival in combat, but by the capacity to uphold compassion in its aftermath. The sun, low on the horizon, cast long shadows over the valley, painting the dust in muted gold and copper. Even as night approached, signaling a chance for rest, the companions understood that exhaustion was not simply a state of the body. It was a test of spirit, of courage, of the capacity to endure beyond instinct and physical strength. And in moving forward, tending the wounded, and offering presence in the midst of suffering, they discovered that the heart could hold steadfast even when the body faltered, and that true endurance required not only strength, but compassion, faith, and unwavering commitment. The valley was no longer merely a battlefield. It had become a place of urgent care, quiet desperation, and grim deliberation. The companions moved among the fallen, their eyes scanning for those in most immediate need, hands steady despite the tremors of fatigue. Every step revealed the harsh realities of war. Injuries crude and severe, spirits frayed, and the unrelenting demand for triage amid chaos. Compassion guided their actions, yet practicality dictated each choice, a delicate balance between heart and reason that weighed heavily on all of them. Lysandra knelt beside a young soldier whose leg had been caught beneath a fallen beam. She worked quickly, applying pressure to staunch bleeding, murmuring words of reassurance even as she measured each movement against her limited knowledge of anatomy and field care. There were no experts here, no surgeons with years of study to guide her hands, only intuition, training in basic first aid, and a desperate determination to preserve life. Each decision carried consequence. Too little pressure, and the soldier could bleed out. Too much, and further damage might occur. Kael organized the companions into small teams, prioritizing wounds, rationing supplies, and instructing those with the faintest knowledge of medicine to assist where possible. The challenge was not only physical, but moral. With limited resources and an ever-growing number of casualties, they had to make decisions that no one wished to confront. Who could be saved with the time and materials available? Who required attention that could not be provided? Every choice bore weight. Every triage decision a quiet reckoning with mortality. Compassion was tested at every turn. The companions moved swiftly from one injured soldier to the next, offering water, bandages, and encouragement. Tears mingled with dust and sweat, but the work could not pause. Even the most seemingly minor injuries demanded attention, as infection, shock, and neglect could turn manageable wounds into death sentences. In every encounter, the companions balanced speed with care, urgency with gentleness, heart with reason, a constant negotiation between what was possible and what was necessary. Amid this struggle, hard choices emerged. A soldier with multiple injuries, each life-threatening on its own, required more time and resources than were immediately available. Another, only lightly wounded, demanded reassurance and emotional attention to stave off panic. The companions moved with deliberate calculation, knowing that even the most compassionate acts might leave others unattended, that mercy had its limits in the crucible of war. Lysandra's hands trembled despite her focus. She had stabilized one soldier only to realize that another required urgent care. Her heart ached at the impossibility of attending to all, at the lives she could not touch, at the quiet sorrow of those left waiting. Kael's voice, calm but firm, reminded her to continue, to trust the system they had improvised. Yet even he carried the weight of hard choices, the burden of seeing suffering and knowing that some could not be prevented. The valley, once echoing with battle cries and the clash of steel, now carried a different sound. Soft groans, whispered prayers, the shuffle of cautious steps, and the quiet instructions of those attempting to preserve life amid the carnage. And within this quieter rhythm emerged the first notes of mourning. A soldier who had succumbed despite care, a companion's tearful acknowledgement of a life lost, the slow, painful realization that even heroism could not forestall death. In these moments, grief was inseparable from duty. Every act of care was shadowed by the specter of loss. Every stabilization a reminder of what remained fragile and impermanent. The companions understood that tending the wounded was as much an act of moral courage as any battle maneuver, a confrontation with vulnerability, with imperfection, and with the limits of their knowledge and skill. As dusk settled over the valley, the companions moved among the injured and the fallen, their movements deliberate, their hearts heavy, yet unwavering. They would continue to heal, to comfort, and to make the impossible decisions required by circumstance. And in doing so, they recognized that compassion, hard choices, and mourning were bound together. Threads of humanity woven through the chaos of war, shaping not only the battlefield, but the enduring character of those who bore witness to it. The valley had quieted once more. but the silence was heavy, saturated with the echoes of loss. Fallen banners, trampled earth, and scattered weapons testified to the ferocity of conflict. While the companions walked among the wounded and the dead with slow, deliberate steps, every movement reminded them of what had been lost. Not only lives, but the fragile sense of safety, the hope that peace might come without such cost. Grief clung to them like a second skin, pressing on shoulders and hearts alike. Lysandra paused beside a small cluster of fallen soldiers, fingers brushing the dust-streaked face of a young recruit whose courage had shone brightly even in brief combat. Her chest ached with the sharp, unrelenting weight of memory, the last words he had spoken, the expression in his eyes as he had fought to stand, the futile struggle to protect others despite his own fear. She closed her eyes, letting a silent tear fall, and felt the pressure of countless similar memories pressing in all at once. Each loss compounded another, forming a chain of grief that seemed impossible to release. Kael moved among the companions with quiet attentiveness, offering words of comfort where he could, though his own grief was no less acute. Every face he passed reflected some measure of pain. Stifled sobs, blank stares, or clenched jaws masking exhaustion and sorrow. Leadership, he knew, demanded more than strategic guidance in moments like this. It required patience, presence, and the ability to carry hope even when hope seemed distant. He felt the weight of memory himself, recalling each life lost, each companion injured, each choice that had brought pain despite the best intentions. The companions had learned that grief was not a singular moment, but a persistent companion. It came in waves, rising unbidden in quiet intervals between activity or in sudden reminders. A discarded helmet, a child's cry from a distant village, the echo of a comrade's laughter now silenced. Patience was required, both with themselves and with one another, for sorrow could manifest in anger, in withdrawal, or in restless energy that demanded gentle guidance to transform into reflection rather than despair. Hope, however fragile, persisted in these moments. Even amid mourning, the companions found meaning in small acts, tending to the wounded, sharing food, offering water, and performing simple rituals of remembrance. Each act reaffirmed the principle that life, though vulnerable, was still worth sustaining. The valley, though marred by violence, became a canvas for resilience, a place where grief and compassion interwove, and where the companions could honor memory through purposeful action. Lysandra knelt beside a wounded soldier, pressing a cloth to a shallow wound, and whispered a prayer for guidance, for courage, and for the spirits of those who had fallen. The words brought temporary solace, a thread of light woven through the weight of sorrow. She realized that prayer was not merely supplication, but reflection, a way to confront grief honestly, to acknowledge fear and sadness, and to reorient the heart toward patience and hope. Kael joined her in silence, his gaze sweeping the valley as dusk approached. The fading light highlighted the contours of the landscape scarred by conflict, casting long shadows over figures both living and fallen. Together, they reflected on the events of the day, the courage witnessed, the losses endured, and the impossible choices made in the face of limited knowledge and relentless pressure. They recognized that memory, though heavy, carried wisdom. Each act of loss taught endurance. Each moment of grief demanded empathy, and each decision weighed against consequence shaped the character of those who endured. As night settled over the valley, stars piercing the darkening sky, the companions gathered for quiet prayer and reflection. Hands clasped, voices low, they acknowledged both sorrow and hope, honoring the dead while reaffirming their commitment to care for the living and continue their mission. Memory, grief, and loss were not obstacles to faith, but companions that demanded understanding, patience, and conscious resilience. In that shared silence, punctuated by whispered prayers and soft sobs, the companions felt a fragile yet abiding truth take hold, that even amid loss, grief, and the weight of memory, hearts could remain steadfast, patient, and hopeful. Reflection became not a retreat, but a fortification, a preparation to face another day with courage, compassion, and unwavering moral clarity. The valley, scarred by hours of battle, carried a muted stillness that contrasted sharply with the relentless energy of the previous days. Dust settled unevenly over broken ground, and the distant echoes of movement, shuffling feet, whispered commands, and the occasional groan of the wounded reminded the companions that danger and responsibility were far from over. Yet amid the chaos, moments of quiet emerged, subtle and fleeting, offering brief windows for prayer and reflection. Lysandra knelt by a shallow stream, the water running clear and cool over her hands. The simple act of cleansing both blade and spirit grounded her. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of flowing water and the rustle of leaves serve as a counterpoint to the roar of battle. Her prayer was unhurried, composed of gratitude for survival, requests for guidance, and pleas for the wounded. In these moments, she felt a fragile equilibrium, a stillness that strengthened her resolve even as the world outside the grove threatened to collapse into disorder once more. Kael moved quietly among the companions, pausing to place a hand on a bowed shoulder, offering words that were both blessing and encouragement. His own prayer was unspoken, but no less deliberate, an acknowledgement of human limitation and divine guidance. Leadership, in the midst of turmoil, demanded not only strategic insight, but spiritual clarity. He knew that calm hearts fostered decisive minds, and that moments of prayer, personal or shared, were as essential to endurance as any tactical preparation. The companions discovered that these pockets of calm were not escapes from responsibility, but tools for fortitude. Each prayer, each reflection, became an anchor amid uncertainty. Even when the valley rumbled with distant movements or the wind carried ominous creaks of unstable terrain, the act of turning inward, of seeking guidance, of offering thanks, provided clarity. Fear was not erased, but it was tempered. Exhaustion persisted, but it became manageable. The mind, sharpened by reflection, could engage with the immediate demands of survival without being overwhelmed by the unending pressures of war. Lysandra's gaze lifted from the water to the horizon, noting distant banners and the cautious movements of allied units. Prayer, she realized, did not detach her from responsibility. It sharpened it. With a clear mind and steady heart, she could assess danger, prioritize care, and act decisively without the fog of fatigue or despair clouding judgment. Spiritual practice had become a form of preparation, a reinforcement of courage that complemented training and strategy. Kael gathered the companions briefly, encouraging a shared moment of silent reflection. In unison, they bowed their heads, offering thought and intention not only for survival, but for righteousness in action, for wisdom in leadership, and for compassion toward friend and foe alike. The simple alignment of purpose renewed their focus, weaving together trust in one another and in the guidance they sought beyond themselves. The valley seemed to hold its breath, as though acknowledging the fragile peace carved from chaos by these quiet acts. Leadership, Kael reflected, carried burdens beyond strategy and command. Every order given, every decision made in battle, bore moral weight and emotional consequence. Prayer and reflection did not diminish this responsibility. They clarified it. The ability to balance courage with patience, action with restraint, and decisiveness with empathy was strengthened by a heart attuned to principles higher than immediate survival. Even amid preparation for the next engagement, the companions carried the lessons of stillness with them. Each step, each interaction, each instruction was informed not only by training and experience, but by a consciousness cultivated in quiet reflection and spiritual grounding. They moved forward aware of danger, yet fortified by faith, patience, and the shared resolve of their fellowship. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the valley, the companions stood poised, grounded in prayer, yet ready to act. The rhythm of reflection and duty intertwined, creating a balance that would sustain them through exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. And in this delicate harmony of spirit and responsibility, they understood a profound truth. In the midst of turmoil, steadfast hearts, guided by prayer and faith, could navigate the chaos with clarity, compassion, and unwavering resolve. The valley's quiet was deceptive, though moments of prayer and reflection had offered the companions brief respite. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on Kael and Lysandra. Decisions were no longer abstract exercises in strategy. They bore immediate consequences for every soldier under their command. Each movement, each order, each allocation of resources could shift morale, determine survival, or tip the balance toward chaos. Leadership demanded constant vigilance, clarity, and an unflinching commitment to fairness amid the turbulence of war. Kael stood atop a slight rise, scanning the layout of their encampment. Banners fluttered in the wind, signaling units to hold positions, patrol boundaries, or prepare for imminent engagement. Even in this structured display, imperfections were evident. Soldiers struggled with fatigue, discipline wavered under exhaustion, and the ripple effects of earlier losses left gaps in cohesion. Kael's mind moved rapidly, calculating risks, anticipating enemy movements, and prioritizing tasks. Yet strategy alone was insufficient. Leadership required an awareness of morale, of human frailty, and of the delicate thread connecting each individual's strength to the unity of the whole. Lysandra moved through the ranks, offering encouragement, listening to concerns, and addressing disputes that threatened cohesion. Her presence was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that fairness and justice could coexist with discipline. She mediated disagreements over rations, assignments, and rotations, striving to maintain both efficiency and morale. Soldiers watched, learning from her example that their commanders valued both skill and humanity, that their leaders understood the weight of their burdens as intimately as the burdens themselves. Strategy and morality intertwined in subtle, often invisible ways. Orders had to account for terrain, timing, and resources, but also for fatigue, fear, and the uneven distribution of strength among troops. Each choice carried consequences that were both tactical and ethical. Sending a detachment on a dangerous reconnaissance might yield critical intelligence, but it risked lives. Holding a position to defend a vulnerable flank preserved morale, yet invited prolonged exposure and exhaustion. Kael and Lysandra weighed every option with painstaking care, aware that soldiers' trust depended not only on competence, but on consistent fairness and consideration. The companions observed that leadership under pressure was as much about perception as reality. Soldiers needed to see decisiveness tempered by empathy, strength balanced with patience, and authority aligned with integrity. Even small gestures, acknowledging an individual's contribution, offering reassurance during moments of doubt, listening to complaints, carried disproportionate weight in shaping morale and cohesion. Leadership was a delicate choreography, requiring attention to both the battlefield and the human spirit. Amid these pressures, a critical decision loomed: the arbitration proposed to prevent further bloodshed. The choice demanded not only strategic insight, but moral judgment, for its implications would extend beyond immediate survival. Kael and Lysandra debated options, considering both the enemy's perspective and their own obligations to the soldiers under their care. The challenge was immense. Honor the principles of diplomacy without compromising security, respect the humanity of the opposing forces without endangering their own, and make decisions that balance justice, prudence, and the ever-present uncertainty of war. Every scenario, every calculation carried tension. To act too hastily could invite disaster. To hesitate risked the erosion of trust and morale. And yet, the companions understood that the arbitration was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a crucible of leadership, a test of judgment, and a moral decision whose consequences would ripple far beyond the immediate valley. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the encampment, Kael and Lysandra gathered their lieutenants to review plans. The soldiers awaited guidance. Morale hung in delicate equilibrium, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. Leaders under pressure, they realized, did not merely command actions. They shaped hearts, preserved cohesion, and bore the invisible weight of responsibility for every life in their charge. And in this convergence of strategy, morality, and human endurance, the companions braced for the arbitration, knowing that their decisions would test not only their skill as commanders, but their integrity as stewards of lives, trust, and the fragile hope of peace. The valley, long a stage for battle and brief moments of prayer, now bore witness to a different tension, one of negotiation rather than combat, of words rather than weapons. Kael and Lysandra arrived at the neutral meeting ground with measured steps, each aware of the weight carried not only by their own forces, but by the lives, loyalties, and hopes of the enemy. The air was thick with unease, a combination of dust, sweat, and the unspoken anxiety that accompanies decisions whose consequences are both immediate and enduring. The arbitration began with formalities, each side presenting demands, grievances, and proposals. Yet even the structured protocols could not mask the underlying currents of distrust and frustration. Words were weighed carefully, yet interpreted through lenses colored by prior losses, fear, and fatigue. A seemingly minor phrase could ignite suspicion. A pause, however innocent, could be construed as insult or defiance. Every gesture carried weight. Every expression was scrutinized, and every decision threatened to tip the fragile balance between accord and renewed hostility. Kael felt the pressure acutely. Each concession he considered had to account for both tactical reality and moral principle. To concede too much might endanger their troops or embolden the enemy. To refuse entirely could fracture the tentative trust painstakingly built over weeks of dialogue and careful negotiation. The companions who accompanied him exchanged cautious glances, aware that every misstep could ripple through the ranks, eroding morale or creating uncertainty about leadership judgment. Lysandra observed the opposing commanders closely, noting their gestures, tone, and expressions. She understood that negotiation was as much about reading the human element as it was about assessing proposals. The opposing forces were not caricatures or abstract adversaries. They were individuals with their own pressures, fears, and loyalties. Recognizing this humanity made concessions more complex and moral decisions more fraught. It was impossible to navigate purely from strategy. Discernment required empathy, patience, and the courage to act with integrity amid ambiguity. Confusion arose quickly. Proposals overlapped, some contradictory, some impractical, and some steeped in past grievances that could not easily be resolved. Delegates spoke over one another, seeking leverage, testing patience, or simply venting the frustration accumulated through weeks of waiting, loss, and exhaustion. The companions found themselves juggling comprehension, strategy, and diplomacy simultaneously, mentally parsing which concessions could be made without compromise of security, which compromises were ethically defensible, and which would sow long-term discord. Time stretched, dragging the arbitration into an exhausting rhythm. Hours felt like days. Each pause allowed tension to accumulate. Each motion to consider words became a source of anxiety. The valley outside remained quiet but menacing, as though nature itself mirrored the fragile uncertainty within the meeting space. In the midst of deliberation, the companions understood that the decisions made here would not only affect the immediate conflict, but would resonate for months, shaping alliances, testing loyalties, and influencing the very perception of justice among their own troops. Finally, partial agreements emerged, provisions for truce, territory, and limited cooperation. But they were compromises that satisfied few completely. Even among the companions, unease persisted. The arbitration had avoided immediate bloodshed, but it had also left fissures. Resentment, suspicion, and doubt lingered on both sides. Some soldiers interpreted concessions as weakness, while others questioned the fairness of terms that seemed favorable to one faction over another. The seeds of fragmentation, subtle but undeniable, had been sown. As the meeting concluded and the parties withdrew to their respective camps, the companions felt the duality of relief and foreboding. They had achieved a measure of peace, yet the long-term consequences were uncertain. The arbitration had provided temporary clarity, but revealed the complexities of leadership, loyalty, and moral judgment in conflict. Even success carried cost, for the agreements reached left unanswered questions and latent tensions that would challenge cohesion, trust, and the fragile hope of lasting reconciliation. The valley, once again, fell into uneasy quiet. The companions returned to their lines with heavy hearts, aware that the battle for unity, morale, and justice was far from over. The controversial arbitration had granted pause, but the true test of leadership and human endurance, amid both triumph and fracture, was only beginning. The valley's uneasy quiet after the arbitration felt like a fragile veneer stretched over underlying turbulence. Though open conflict had been temporarily halted, the companions sensed the subtle fractures that now threaded through their ranks. Disagreements once dormant erupted quietly but insistently. Misunderstandings festered, and differing interpretations of fairness and duty began to strain relationships that had previously seemed unbreakable. Unity, they realized, was never guaranteed. It was earned, nurtured, and constantly tested, particularly in the aftermath of morally complex decisions. Lysandra noticed the first signs early: quiet murmurs during formation, reluctant nods at orders, and fleeting expressions of doubt in soldiers' eyes. At first, she attributed these tensions to fatigue and the lingering stress of battle. But as the day wore on, it became clear that the arbitration's compromises had introduced subtle resentment. Some companions questioned whether concessions had gone too far, while others feared that assertiveness might provoke renewed hostility. Every conversation carried the weight of scrutiny. Every decision became a microcosm of broader concerns, and every gesture risked misinterpretation. Kael felt the pressure acutely. Leadership had always demanded attention to both strategy and morale, but the arbitration had shifted the landscape. Now, he had to navigate not only external threats, but internal uncertainties. Soldiers who had once followed orders without question paused, questioning the rationale behind assignments or the wisdom of previous decisions. Misunderstandings about intent multiplied quickly. One hesitant command could be perceived as indecision, one corrective remark as criticism. The companions' cohesion, forged through shared struggle, now trembled under the weight of doubt and divergent expectations. The stress was cumulative. Long days of vigilance, combined with emotional exhaustion from loss and moral burden, left little resilience to absorb the strains of disagreement. Arguments, even when brief, reverberated through the camp, amplifying fatigue and fraying nerves. Simple tasks, patrolling boundaries, repairing equipment, distributing rations, required more effort, not only physically but emotionally, as companions navigated subtle tensions in addition to practical responsibilities. Every interaction demanded patience, diplomacy, and careful attention to tone and intent. Even minor miscommunications carried outsized consequences. An instruction, misunderstood, could delay preparation for potential enemy movement. A reminder to rest could be interpreted as weakness. A strategic suggestion could spark dissent. The companions recognized that these small fissures, if left unattended, could widen into cracks that undermined the very trust necessary to survive in the valley. Stress was no longer only external. It had become an internal, pervasive presence, testing judgment, temper, and endurance. In response, Lysandra and Cale worked tirelessly to restore equilibrium. They held private conversations, mediated disagreements, and reinforced shared purpose. Yet even with deliberate effort, the companions could not completely erase the undercurrent of tension. Each act of reconciliation required energy already depleted by weeks of vigilance, combat, and moral decision-making. Every intervention reminded them that unity was fragile, and that the cost of fractured trust could be as severe as any physical danger on the battlefield. Fatigue, once primarily physical, deepened into something more insidious. Muscles ached, minds wandered, and patience thinned. Sleep brought only temporary reprieve, often interrupted by nightmares or the replay of unresolved disputes. Companions felt their resilience waning, a slow erosion intensified by constant vigilance and the awareness that cohesion itself had become a challenge. Even moments of reflection and prayer, once sources of steadying strength, now carried reminders of fragility and impermanence. And yet, amid the trembling unity, the companions persisted. They understood that survival and mission required more than individual endurance. It demanded collective vigilance, mutual understanding, and the ability to navigate both human complexity and battlefield peril. Every decision, every act of patience, every intentional effort to communicate clearly became part of a larger strategy, preserving cohesion, mitigating stress, and maintaining focus despite the uncertainty and strain that now permeated the valley. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across tents and ranks, the companions gathered briefly, exchanging silent acknowledgement of shared weariness and unspoken commitment. Unity trembled, but it had not yet fractured completely. The challenge was clear: navigate disagreement, restore trust, and continue forward, even as fatigue gnawed at body and mind, and the lingering consequences of arbitration and conflict loomed over every step. The valley bore the marks of enduring struggle. Dust clung to armor and skin. Tents sagged under the weight of wind and fatigue, and the scattered remnants of skirmishes testified to relentless effort. Every day brought repetition, reconnaissance, fortification, tending the wounded, maintaining supplies, and constant vigilance against both enemy action and the unpredictable elements of terrain. Yet it was not only the physical labor that weighed heavily on the companions. It was the cumulative drain on mind, heart, and spirit, the slow erosion that comes with prolonged conflict. Lysandra felt it acutely. Each dawn, rising with aching muscles and the unyielding awareness of another day demanding resilience, she recognized that her body could endure only so much. Yet the weariness that pressed against her shoulders went deeper than fatigue. It was emotional. The unrelenting pressure of responsibility, the grief for lives lost, and the moral strain of decisions that affected not only her companions, but countless others. It was spiritual as well, a subtle questioning of purpose and meaning amidst hardship. She prayed, not always for guidance, but for the fortitude to continue, to maintain integrity, and to sustain the courage required for each choice. Kael, too, recognized the compound toll of prolonged engagement. Leadership required constant assessment, coordination, and decision-making. Yet the energy required for vigilance extended beyond physical exertion. Emotional endurance was taxed by the need to balance competing priorities, mediate conflict, and offer reassurance in the midst of pervasive anxiety. Spiritual resilience was tested as well, for even steadfast faith could feel fragile when confronted daily with suffering, uncertainty, and ethical compromise. Logistical challenges magnified fatigue. Food supplies dwindled, weapons required constant maintenance, and the wounded demanded continuous attention. Every action demanded careful allocation of energy and resources. Soldiers shuffled wearily across camp, and even simple tasks, distributing rations, reinforcing defenses, carrying water, became exercises in patience and endurance. Mistakes, born of tired minds or frayed nerves, could escalate quickly, underscoring the relentless pressure that prolonged conflict imposed on both leadership and rank. The emotional strain was no less taxing. Companions mourned quietly for the dead, while grappling with frustration, fear, and the lingering uncertainties of arbitration and internal division. Tension, once subtle, had grown perceptible, manifesting in terse words, reluctant gestures, and fleeting glances that betrayed doubts about cohesion and strategy. Even small disagreements became magnified under the pressure of exhaustion, and every interaction demanded heightened awareness to prevent discord from undermining effectiveness and trust. Spiritually, weariness settled like a fog over reflection and faith. Prayer and meditation, once sources of clarity, now carried the weight of repeated supplication, the quiet acknowledgement of unanswered questions, and the recognition that even devotion could not eliminate the realities of war. Yet these moments remained essential, providing intermittent clarity, a tether to hope, and a reminder that endurance was not solely physical, but integrated with heart and conscience. Amid this fatigue, thoughts of home became both refuge and torment. Memories of familiar landscapes, comforting routines, and loved ones stirred warmth, yet deepened longing. The companions reflected on the lives they had left behind. Families, friends, villages, and routines untouched by war. These recollections offered brief solace, but also a poignant reminder of what had been sacrificed, what was at stake, and why perseverance, even in the face of exhaustion, remained imperative. Lysandra watched the horizon, imagining distant hearths and quiet evenings now inaccessible, yet she drew strength from the thought of returning, even as uncertainty loomed. Kael encouraged companions to rest when possible, acknowledging that their endurance was intertwined with the human need for reprieve, reflection, and the preservation of spirit. They began to recognize that survival required more than vigilance. It demanded balance between duty and self-preservation, between action and reflection. As night approached, the companions gathered briefly, sharing quiet words, small gestures of reassurance, and mutual acknowledgement of the relentless strain. In this simple fellowship, they found a measure of fortitude, the understanding that weariness was inevitable, but that shared resolve, reflection, and the memory of home could sustain heart and mind, offering direction and meaning even amid the protracted trials of war. The valley, though scarred and weary, remained alive with quiet movement. Soldiers tended equipment, patched armor, and carried water, their motions steady but subdued, like echoes of a rhythm long overstrained. Amid the routine, the companions found their minds drifting inward, toward the places and people left behind, small villages, familiar hearths, and the families whose faces lingered in memory like a soft, persistent light. The contrast between home and the present turmoil pressed upon them, filling their hearts with a mixture of longing, sorrow, and resolve. Lysandra leaned against a weathered tree, eyes tracing the distant hills beyond the valley. She imagined the warmth of her family's hearth, the smell of freshly baked bread, the quiet laughter of siblings. These thoughts brought both comfort and pain. Comfort in the memory of what she cherished, pain in the awareness that the world she returned to might never resemble the peace she remembered. Yet in that duality, she drew strength. The vision of home became a beacon, a reason to endure, a reminder of what was worth defending, even in the midst of uncertainty and loss. Kale, too, allowed his thoughts to drift beyond the camp. Faces of his kin surfaced with remarkable clarity, the patience of a mother's counsel, the determined hands of a father at work, the unspoken bonds of lifelong friendship. These recollections were bittersweet. They reminded him of everything he hoped to preserve, of the life that awaited beyond the war, yet also of the fragility of human connection when torn apart by conflict. Each memory underscored the urgency of thoughtful action and the responsibility inherent in leadership. Longing for home intertwined with reflections on peace. The valley, a crucible of human endurance, made the companions acutely aware of what peace required, not merely the absence of battle, but the presence of justice, fairness, and understanding among neighbors and kin. In imagining a future where families could gather without fear, where children could play untroubled by the shadow of conflict, they glimpsed both hope and the complexity of attaining it. Peace was not simple. It demanded compromise, courage, and moral clarity, even amid chaos. Yet the nostalgia of home brought another, subtler awareness, the moral complexity of civil war. Unlike conflicts fought against distant enemies, here the adversary was not wholly abstract. Opposing forces were neighbors, friends, and those who shared common values and history. Lysandra understood that victory came with profound ethical considerations. Every maneuver, every order, every act of aggression carried weight beyond immediate survival, touching families, villages, and futures. The longing for home became inseparable from the responsibility to act justly, to navigate choices that would honor human dignity, even amid confrontation. Kael gathered the companions briefly, not for strategy, but for reflection. "Remember why we endure," he said, voice steady but gentle. "Not for glory, nor for pride, but for the chance that those we love may see a better world. His words were met with quiet nods, gestures of acknowledgement, and a shared understanding that even as fatigue weighed on body and spirit, the memory of home and the desire to preserve it was a compass guiding moral judgment. Companions walked among tents and fires with renewed awareness, sharing recollections of family meals, quiet walks, and celebrations long past. Each story, each whispered memory, reinforced bonds between them, reminding them that while war might scatter bodies and ambitions, the human heart could remain tethered to home, compassion, and hope. In this shared nostalgia, they found not only solace, but clarity. That endurance required a constant balance of courage, empathy, and reflection, and that moral choices could not be divorced from the human consequences they carried. As dusk settled over the valley, the companions lingered, eyes tracing the horizon and imagining the hearths, villages, and loved ones that awaited them. They knew that the road ahead would demand continued resilience, strategic thought, and moral vigilance. Longing for home was not merely sentiment. It was a call to action, a reminder of responsibility, and a lens through which every choice, compromise, and act of courage could be measured. In that twilight, the companions understood a profound truth. The memory of home, the love of family, and the vision of peace could anchor hearts amid turmoil, even as civil strife tested their judgment, patience, and moral clarity. The valley was no longer merely a stage for tactical maneuvering or negotiation. It had become a theater of human sorrow, a space where the companions confronted the harshest reality of civil strife. The knowledge that those they faced were not strangers, but fellow Muslims, bound by shared faith, history, and values. Each clash, each wounded soldier, each life lost, carried with it a weight heavier than any ordinary battle. For the pain was amplified by the awareness that these were brothers, sons, and fathers caught on opposing sides. Lysandra moved among her companions with measured steps, her eyes tracing the expressions of exhaustion, grief, and quiet resolve. Even in moments of action, she felt the tug of sorrow for those on the other side. People who might have shared prayers, feasts, and celebrations in a world free from conflict. The companions had entered this struggle with conviction, yet the reality of facing co-religionists tempered every act of courage with humility, restraint, and moral reflection. Each maneuver was guided not only by strategy, but by the recognition that mercy, compassion, and fairness were essential, even when the heat of battle demanded decisiveness. Kyle, too, felt the ache of this internal conflict deeply. Orders had to be given with clarity and authority, yet each directive carried the implicit acknowledgement that mistakes or misjudgments could cost the life of a believer, a person bound to God in the same way as himself. Leadership in civil strife required a dual focus, ensuring the safety and morale of one's own forces while honoring the humanity and dignity of those aligned differently. Every engagement was measured not solely in tactical terms, but in moral and spiritual consequences. The companions' sorrow was reflected in the care they took with the wounded. Those they encountered on opposing lines were treated with the same attention and respect given to their own. Bandages were applied carefully, water offered gently, and words of reassurance given whenever possible. It was a labor both of duty and of conscience, a recognition that the shared faith and human dignity of the enemy could not be erased by the divisions of war. In these moments, compassion became both a weapon and a shield, an act of spiritual courage amid physical conflict. The emotional toll was relentless. Each fallen soldier on either side reinforced the gravity of the situation, the bitter truth that civil strife could wound beyond the body, shaping hearts, perceptions, and the collective memory of the community. Companions wrestled with grief that mingled sorrow for loss, with frustration over the necessity of conflict, for they understood that victory achieved at the expense of brothers in faith was hollow, tinged with moral ambiguity that no amount of triumph could erase. In quiet moments, reflection became essential. The companions recounted lessons learned, the importance of restraint, the need for clear communication, and the recognition that compassion and mercy could coexist with courage and decisiveness. They considered how internal conflict magnified the consequences of error, how patience could prevent unnecessary bloodshed, and how the careful weighing of action and consequence could shape both the immediate battlefield and the broader spiritual landscape. Even amid sorrow, hope persisted. The companions understood that lessons forged in the crucible of internal struggle were invaluable, shaping not only strategy, but character. Each encounter, each decision, each act of compassion toward a fellow Muslim became a testament to the endurance of faith and humanity, even when tested by circumstance. The pain of civil conflict underscored the necessity of moral vigilance, ethical leadership, and measured action, lessons that would endure long after the dust settled. As the sun dipped below the valley's rim, casting long shadows across the scarred earth, Lysandra and Kyle gathered their companions. They spoke softly, not of victory, but of accountability, mercy, and the enduring importance of conscience. In their words, the companions found guidance, solace, and direction. That even in the most bitter conflicts, the principles of faith, compassion, and respect must guide every action, and that the pain of fighting one's own could, paradoxically, teach the greatest lessons of wisdom and humanity. The valley had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Skirmishes had become less frequent. The wounded were tended, and the immediate urgency of battle had eased into reflection, planning, and observation. Yet the companions, though outwardly composed, bore within them the indelible marks of conflict, memories of lost comrades, difficult decisions, and the sorrow of facing fellow believers in strife. From these experiences, lessons had crystallized, truths about patience, endurance, humility, and responsibility that would remain long after the campaign ended. Lysandra walked through the encampment, observing companions engaged in the quiet tasks of camp life. Each movement, each interaction seemed infused with the awareness of hard-won insight. Patience had become more than a virtue. It was a necessity. Whether negotiating with allies, tending to the wounded, or making tactical decisions, every act demanded measured thought. Rash action could compromise lives, undermine morale, or exacerbate internal divisions. The companions understood now that endurance was not merely physical, but emotional and spiritual, requiring constant vigilance and the ability to persist even when fatigue and doubt pressed relentlessly. Kayel addressed the assembled companions, not with orders, but with reflection. He spoke of humility, reminding them that leadership and skill were meaningful only when tempered by awareness of human limitation. No victory was absolute, no plan flawless, and no act could erase the moral weight of choices made under pressure. By acknowledging their own fallibility, the companions cultivated empathy, strengthened cohesion, and fostered the clarity necessary to navigate complex ethical landscapes. Responsibility emerged as a guiding principle that linked every lesson learned. Every decision carried consequence for the wounded, for the families of the fallen, and for the broader community of believers. The companions recognized that courage alone was insufficient. Moral awareness, accountability, and foresight were essential in sustaining not only survival, but justice, trust, and the integrity of the collective effort. Even small acts, a careful allocation of resources, thoughtful mediation of disagreement, or the measured delivery of command, reinforced the companions' awareness that responsibility extended beyond immediate outcomes to encompass the well-being of the whole. The campaign had also instilled a deeper understanding of resilience. Physical fatigue, emotional strain, and spiritual questioning were inevitable. Yet endurance did not rely solely on strength of body or mind. It relied on shared commitment, faith, and the careful cultivation of hope. Companions learned to draw sustenance from small victories, from acts of compassion, and from the knowledge that perseverance, even in the face of hardship, shaped character and fortified community. Lysandra paused to watch a young soldier tending a minor wound with care and diligence. She smiled faintly, recognizing that lessons learned were being transmitted quietly through action as well as instruction. Each companion, intending, guiding, or leading, became both student and teacher, passing wisdom born of hardship to those who would continue the mission, ensuring that experience was neither lost nor forgotten. Even in moments of rest, the companions carried reflection with them. Quiet evenings were filled with shared observations about strategy, morality, and human endurance. Conversations circled around the importance of tempering courage with prudence, of coupling action with empathy, and of recognizing that victory and justice were intertwined. The lessons of patience, humility, and responsibility became both shield and compass, guiding decisions and interactions as the campaign moved steadily toward its conclusion. As the sun dipped low over the valley, painting the landscape in gold and shadow, the companions gathered one final time to acknowledge what they had learned. Words were few, but their significance was immense. Acknowledgement of fatigue, gratitude for survival, and recognition of the moral clarity forged through experience. They had endured hardship, faced ethical complexity, and borne witness to suffering both near and far. And in that endurance, they had acquired insight that would guide them long after the campaign ended. With hearts tempered by challenge and minds sharpened by reflection, the companions understood that the final stages of the campaign would demand the same patience, humility, and moral vigilance that had carried them thus far. The lessons they bore were not abstract. They were practical tools for the decisions, reconciliations, and responsibilities that lay ahead, shaping the path toward closure, resolution, and the hope of lasting peace. The battlefield, once alive with the clamor of swords and shouts, had begun to settle into an uneasy stillness. Dust hung in the air, stirred only by the slow movements of soldiers packing supplies, tending the wounded, or repositioning banners. Yet even in this apparent quiet, tension remained palpable. The end of Siffin was not marked by triumphant victory, but by a measured withdrawal that carried the weight of uncertainty and the emotional burden of unresolved conflict. Lysandra walked along the edge of the camp, observing companions as they dismantled temporary fortifications. Her steps were deliberate, her eyes tracing familiar landmarks scarred by battle. She felt the heaviness of the day, the accumulated fatigue from weeks of relentless vigilance, moral deliberation, and spiritual exertion. The campaign's end brought no immediate relief, only a slow, creeping awareness that the outcome, though partially concluded, left questions unresolved and hearts burdened. Kael gathered the companions in small groups, providing guidance on orderly withdrawal and ensuring that logistical concerns were addressed. Morale, while not shattered, was fragile. Soldiers moved with quiet urgency, their faces marked by exhaustion and contemplation. The emotional heaviness of fighting fellow Muslims lingered, mingling with the grief for lives lost, the anxiety over unresolved disputes, and the moral reflection that had defined the campaign's course. Even as they prepared to depart, the weight of the valley and its battles remained tangible. Withdrawal required both precision and patience. Supplies had to be secured, the wounded accounted for, and positions cleared carefully to prevent missteps. Every movement was deliberate, yet each step carried symbolic significance. Leaving the field did not erase the experiences of battle, it magnified them. The companions felt acutely that every decision, every act of mercy, and every hard choice remained etched into memory, shaping not only individual character, but the collective conscience of their group. Amid practical concerns, uncertainty pressed heavily. The arbitration had brought temporary reprieve, yet the seeds of fragmentation and lingering suspicion remained. Decisions about leadership, alliances, and strategy were no longer theoretical. They would carry consequences for months, perhaps years, into the future. Companions reflected quietly on the moral and strategic implications, understanding that withdrawal was not an end, but a transition from active engagement to the unresolved echoes of consequence. Emotional reflection was unavoidable. Soldiers paused to speak of lost comrades, to share memories of courage, and to acknowledge the profound challenges of the campaign. Lysandra found herself thinking not only of the battlefield, but of home, family, and the life that awaited beyond the valley. Each memory of loved ones provided both solace and a poignant reminder of what had been risked, what had been sacrificed, and what remained to be reconciled. The weight of responsibility extended beyond the immediate battlefield to the broader community, the homes left behind, and the trust placed in the companion's judgment. Even in withdrawal, lessons learned guided action. Patience tempered urgency, humility moderated authority, and compassion informed every interaction. Soldiers supported one another quietly, carrying wounded comrades, sharing food and water, and offering encouragement amid fatigue. The slow pace of departure allowed reflection alongside movement, ensuring that each step honored both duty and conscience. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the companions paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. Shadows stretched long across the earth, revealing the scars of conflict and the paths of retreat. Silence settled over the group, broken only by the soft murmur of the wind through distant trees. In that stillness, the emotional weight of the campaign was most palpable. Exhaustion, sorrow, moral reflection, and the lingering uncertainty of unresolved conflict. Yet even amid these burdens, the companions felt the quiet assurance that their actions, guided by courage, compassion, and conscience, had mattered. Turning toward the path home, they carried with them the lessons of endurance, patience, and moral vigilance, aware that the end of Siffin was not an erasure of struggle, but a continuation of responsibility to preserve peace, honor the fallen, and restore the bonds of community fractured by conflict. The road home stretched long and familiar, yet it was impossible for the companions to see it as they had before the campaign. Every tree, hill, and river seemed altered in their perception, imbued with the weight of memory and the scars of conflict. The companions moved with measured steps, weary from weeks of battle, negotiation, and moral deliberation, carrying not only the physical fatigue of war, but the indelible imprint of sorrow, reflection, and hard-earned wisdom. Lysandra's heart tightened with each familiar landmark. Villages she had passed countless times now appeared both comforting and foreign. The streets she once knew seemed quieter, almost fragile, as if the very landscape were holding its breath in anticipation of her return. She noticed details she had overlooked before: children playing cautiously near their homes, neighbors greeting each other with subdued awareness, elders observing the passage of soldiers who bore the aura of hardship. The world had continued without her, yet she carried a weight that set her apart, a consciousness shaped by conflict and responsibility. Kael walked alongside her, observing the companions in thoughtful silence. Each soldier bore signs of change, subtle and profound. The way they carried themselves, the somber expressions that replaced youthful levity, the quiet moments when laughter felt distant. Reintegration was not merely a matter of returning to home and hearth. It was the careful navigation of memory, emotion, and relationship. The companions had been altered by experience, and the act of rejoining ordinary life required both patience and reflection. Even amid familiar surroundings, reminders of the campaign lingered. Scars, minor and profound, served as daily testimony to endurance. Emotional wounds surfaced in unexpected moments. A glance, a smell, or a sound could trigger recollections of battle, loss, or moral decision. Companions comforted one another quietly, offering words of understanding or simply shared presence, recognizing that reintegration required acknowledgement of trauma as much as celebration of survival. The moral lessons carried by the companions were evident in subtle ways. Decisions, once guided by urgency and strategy, now informed interactions at home, in family, and in community. Patience, humility, and compassion had been forged in the crucible of conflict, And these qualities now shaped relationships with kin and neighbors. Small gestures, a careful word, a considerate action, a mindful listening, reflected wisdom earned through hardship. The companions understood that reintegration was not a return to the past, but a transformation guided by the values preserved and strengthened through trial. Memories of fallen comrades lingered alongside thoughts of home. The companions honored these memories quietly, recognizing that grief and gratitude were inseparable. Even amid reunions, they spoke of courage, loss, and moral responsibility, ensuring that the lessons of the campaign remained alive. Stories were shared not as tales of glory, but as reflections on endurance, compassion, and the human consequences of conflict. For the families awaiting their return, the companions appeared both familiar and altered. Eyes met with recognition, yet there was a subtle distance born of experience that could not be undone. Conversations were deliberate, gestures measured, and every interaction carried layers of meaning. Reintegration required sensitivity and understanding that home was both a sanctuary and a space of continued adaptation. The companions learned to navigate these boundaries with care, offering presence, support, and attention while preserving the introspection necessary to honor the experiences that had reshaped them. As night fell over familiar rooftops and quiet lanes, the companions gathered briefly, reflecting on the journey completed. They had survived battle, moral dilemmas, and internal struggle. They had faced sorrow and ethical complexity, endured fatigue and emotional strain, and returned with hearts tempered by patience and conscience. Returning home was not an endpoint, but a continuation, a transition into a life forever, informed by what had been endured, remembered, and learned. The companions understood a profound truth. They were home, yet changed. Their legacy was no longer solely measured in action on the battlefield, but in the wisdom, humility, and moral vigilance that would guide every choice in the life beyond the campaign. The companions had returned to their homes, to hearths and villages, yet the valley of Siffin lingered in their minds like a shadow that refused to fade. The experiences they carried of battle, negotiation, moral deliberation, and internal strife were not merely personal. They were threads woven into the fabric of the Ummah itself. Each lesson, each sorrow, and each act of endurance resonated far beyond individual memory, shaping religious understanding, political consciousness, and social cohesion in ways subtle yet enduring. Lysandra reflected quietly as she walked through her village, observing the routines of daily life. The marketplace buzzed with commerce. Children played in dusty lanes, and neighbors greeted one another with customary warmth. Yet beneath the surface of familiarity, she recognized shifts that traced back to Siffin, the heightened awareness of the responsibilities of leadership, the need for justice tempered with mercy, and the fragile balance between authority and accountability. These were not abstract lessons. They were lived principles, mirrored in every community decision, every dialogue about governance, and every reflection on faith and moral duty. Kael, speaking to younger companions who had also returned, emphasized the intertwined nature of political and spiritual responsibility. The lessons of Siffin, he said, are not merely about strategy or victory. They are about stewardship, guiding people, honoring the trust placed in us, and ensuring that faith and justice remain central, even amid disagreement. The ripple of our choices extends far beyond the battlefield. His words found resonance, for the companions understood that internal conflict carried consequences not only for immediate survival, but for the cohesion, trust, and moral direction of the entire Ummah. Socially, Siffin left its mark in both caution and wisdom. Communities recognized the fragility of relationships when tension, suspicion, or miscommunication went unaddressed. Companions returned as living examples of endurance, patience, and moral vigilance. Their experiences taught that unity required active cultivation, that reconciliation demanded effort, and that justice and compassion could coexist even in the most morally complex situations. Villages, towns, and congregations began to integrate these lessons in daily governance, dispute resolution, and communal practice, guided by the understanding that the costs of civil strife were not merely physical, but deeply ethical and social. Religiously, the companions' reflections highlighted the enduring importance of conscience, mercy, and ethical judgment. The awareness that fellow Muslims had been placed on opposing sides instilled humility, restraint, and vigilance in moral deliberation. Faith was not only a source of personal solace, but a framework for guiding action with integrity, reminding the Ummah that obedience to God must coexist with compassion toward neighbors and prudence in judgment. Siffin became a reference point for sermons, guidance, and community teaching, a reminder that even in disagreement, ethical conduct and reflection on consequences are paramount. Political implications were equally profound. Leaders emerged who were tempered by experience, keenly aware of the responsibilities inherent in command, and mindful of the long-term effects of their decisions. Companions emphasized consensus, ethical arbitration, and careful consideration of dissent, understanding that stability and cohesion rested on principles rather than force alone. The lessons of Siffin informed governance, strategy, and counsel for generations, shaping both policy and perception with subtle but lasting influence. As the companions shared their stories and reflections, the Ummah absorbed not only the events of battle, but the wisdom distilled from endurance, sorrow, and moral struggle. Siffin, with all its tragedy and complexity, became both a cautionary tale and a source of guidance, a reminder that patience, integrity, and empathy are essential to sustaining faith, unity, and justice. In contemplating the long shadow of Siffin, the companions understood that the campaign's true significance lay not only in its immediate outcomes, but in the moral, social, and spiritual shaping of the Ummah. The lessons endured, carried forward by hearts tempered by experience, minds refined by reflection, and communities guided by the principles forged amid trial. Siffin was no longer only a battlefield. It was a living testament to the delicate balance of courage, conscience, and compassion in the life of a unified yet diverse Ummah. The night settled softly over the villages, stretching its calm across fields, streets, and quiet homes. The companions, having returned from the long and trying campaign, moved through the familiar paths with steps softened by exhaustion and relief. The air was cool and fragrant, carrying the faint scent of earth and wood smoke, and every sound seemed gentler. The rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of a stream, and the occasional call of an owl. In this quiet, the weight of the valley, the battles, and the moral dilemmas of Siffin began to dissolve, leaving only the soft contours of memory and reflection. Lysandra paused on a small hill overlooking her village. She watched the golden glow of lanterns through windows, the slow movement of families preparing for rest, and the gentle sway of trees in the night breeze. Her heart, heavy with the lessons and experiences of the campaign, felt a quiet settling. The long journey had taught endurance, courage, humility, and patience. It had carved sorrow and wisdom into her spirit. But now, under the expansive sky, she could feel the deep, restorative rhythm of stillness and completion. Kael walked among the companions, noting their expressions softened by relief and contemplation. Some paused to look at the stars, tracing constellations they had studied in youth or imagined during long nights in camp. Others whispered quiet words of remembrance for those lost or offered thanks for survival. The shared experiences of battle, negotiation, and moral responsibility had left their mark, but the night offered a gentle balm. It reminded the companions that even amid trials, there was space for peace, reflection, and gratitude. The world, in its quietness, invited gentle reflection. Companions sat together near small fires, sharing muted words, gentle laughter, and the unspoken comfort of presence. Each flicker of flame seemed to echo lessons learned. Endurance was strengthened through compassion, courage through ethical clarity, and patience through humility. There were no rushes, no pressing obligations, only the slow, deliberate rhythm of breath and thought, the soft realization that the long journey had reached a pause, a moment for rest, renewal, and quiet understanding. Lysandra imagined the fields she had once played in as a child, the familiar scent of her home, and the gentle cadence of life outside the shadow of conflict. Memories intertwined with lessons, creating a tapestry of reflection that encompassed both sorrow and wisdom. The companions' experiences, though heavy with consequence, were now threads woven into a broader understanding of life, faith, and human connection. They had endured trials that tested body, heart, and spirit, and in enduring, they had grown, learned, and found strength in one another. Slowly, eyes grew heavy, movements slackened, and the companions allowed the weight of the day to guide them toward rest. Thoughts drifted with ease, memories of home, the quiet lessons of endurance, and the hope that future days might carry peace and understanding. The gentle rhythm of night encouraged calm reflection, softening grief and easing tension. Every breath became slower, deeper, and more deliberate, carrying away the residue of fatigue and leaving only a quiet awareness of safety, shared bonds, and the comfort of having reached a place of relative peace. The sky deepened into velvet darkness, scattered with stars like distant lanterns, each a reminder of continuity, hope, and the vastness of God's creation. In their presence, the companions felt a serene connection to the lessons learned, to those they loved, and to the enduring rhythm of life beyond conflict. The heart, weary yet fortified, allowed space for gentle contemplation, gratitude, and the soft settling of spirit. One by one, the companions laid down beneath the soft night sky or within the quiet shelter of home. The hush of the world encouraged slow, even breathing, the body surrendering to calm, the mind embracing gentle reflection. The night whispered of rest earned, of lessons carried forward, and of the enduring balance between courage, conscience, and peace. And as the valley slept, the companions, too, drifted slowly into rest, hearts and minds held in quiet steadiness, ready for the days to come, guided by memory, wisdom, and the gentle constancy of hope